Members of the public, city staff, members of the Planning Commission, we welcome you to the Midway City Planning Commission regular meeting of August 13, 2019. We have a full agenda tonight that we hope we can get through both collegiately and in due time. Before we start, if there's anyone who would like to offer an invocation or offer some opening remarks, I will open the floor for either someone for the audience or someone from the Planning Commission to do that. Reminding that I did it last time, I think.
He says that every time.
You did it so well.
Thank you.
Our Father in heaven, we thank Thee for this beautiful day and for this beautiful valley that we're blessed to live in. We're grateful for the good people that live here. And we thank Thee for the opportunity that we have as a planning commission to serve the community and give back a little of the blessings that we enjoy by living here. And we ask for Thy spirit, wisdom, that we might be able to make decisions that are in the best interests of our community tonight, that we'll be able to have an open and honest discussion on the items that are before us. And we ask for these blessings in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Would all rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Item number 1 on the agenda for the commission is to review and possibly approve the Planning Commission meeting minutes of July 9th, 2019. And am I correct in assuming we've got 2 approvals we need to make of the closed session and the open session separately?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, on the minutes for the regular meeting, does have the commission had a chance to review them and pass any changes that you saw necessary on to Melanie?
I actually didn't pass the one change on to Melanie. Melanie, last page, page 11, the motion, second line of the motion, as part of the study and to do further analyze. I don't know if that's meant to be further analysis or to do analysis or to analyze. But, and that was it. That was the only.
Okay. Any other changes? You have that, Melanie?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do we have a motion?
Sure. I move that we approve the Midway City Planning Commission meetings of July 9th, 2019. I should say the regular meeting minutes
Yes.
of July 9th, 2019.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the Planning Commission meetings of July 9th, 2019. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Second item on the minutes would pertain to the closed session meeting. You have a copy of those minutes?
I was not there.
Oh, okay, so you didn't get one.
Right.
I don't know.
I've got it.
I think
Mr. Chairman, I provided some additional comments
Okay,
already via email.
Besides this page.
okay, so Melanie, do you have those additional comments?
the question, Jen, do I have to, because I wasn't there, recuse myself from the vote?
And just to clarify legally, those minutes only go to those who are actually in that meeting.
Okay.
So if you were not in the meeting, then you would not receive those. And then I guess the question is, you've received, did you make updates to them, or do we need to?
I made just a simple comments. It was.
I think what we need to do is recirculate those based on the suggestion, and then we can come back and approve them in a later date, but let everyone review those.
Okay. All right, so we'll defer dealing with those minutes until the next meeting.
Yes.
Okay,
Just-
thank you.
Quick question on that. Doesn't really disclose anything, but the corrections that you had, there's a line you said not doing A, and then it just stopped on the page that was in our packet. Is that fixed? I'm just saying, there's a line in here that says not doing A, and then there's nothing after that, and that's the paragraph.
Was it on the photos?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay, no, can you email me please, and I'll be happy to.
Okay.
make those changes so we can-
it's just not a complete sentence that
Yeah.
was left off, so something.
Okay. Moving on, before we start with item number 2, I'd like to make just a comment or two before we start consideration of that item. I hope this meeting tonight, this is an item we've had before us before, and it got a little bit contentious a time or two, and we want to make sure that the meeting tonight is held with the proper amount of decorum, that we follow the procedures that are outlined there. We generally run our planning commission meetings fairly loosely, without having everyone have to go through the chairman before they get the floor to make comments or to ask questions or to make suggestions and so forth. But because of the nature of this item, I would ask that we follow strict decorum tonight, and as chairman, I will try to run the meeting a little bit tighter than we normally do. So I hope that we can be able to maintain the order that we deserve as a community. Our planning commission members serve, we're appointed by the city council, and we're an advisory body. We provide recommendations to the mayor and city council on both issues that come up relating to the land use plan, development of the land use plan, and also with any land use applications that come before the city, and that's what we're dealing with here tonight. Our role is going to be to consider and deliberate on the information that has been provided, and we will vote as a commission. With a majority vote, whichever way it goes, the members of the commission will forward a recommendation to the city council. This item was before us previously. We continued it to get answers to some questions that we didn't have. Those answers have now been provided, and we will review that information tonight. When we heard it previously, it was a public meeting and it was open for public comment. Tonight is not scheduled for a public meeting, so it won't necessarily be an open forum. If I deem appropriate to seek, or if members of the commission want to ask questions of the public, they're welcome to do so, at which time members of the public may be allowed to come forward and make a comment. But if there's no questions coming from the planning commission, we will not be opening this for a public discussion. I will point out that when whatever the recommendation goes forward from the planning commission to the city council, that will be a public hearing, and there will be ample opportunity there again to raise whatever issues and have a public forum in which to voice your opinion again. Again, our deliberations are generally based on ensuring that the action before us is consistent with the overall plan for the community and consistent with the ordinances that govern the type of application that's applied for. And that's what we will attempt to do tonight. So with that introduction, item number 2 on the agenda, I guess I better slip to my Rocky Mountain Power and Heber Light and Power are requesting a conditional use permit to rebuild an existing Heber Light and Power transmission line, install a 138 kV line for Rocky Mountain Power that will be located on the Heber Light and Power poles. Proposal will establish a second transmission interconnection, which will strengthen service reliability and increase capacity in Midway and the surrounding area. Portion of the line in Midway is 1 mile in length, will follow the existing transmission line along Ward's Lane, Stringtown Road, and 970 South. The proposed tangent poles range in height from 70 to 85 feet above ground and the dead-end poles and crossing poles range in height from 80 to 110 feet above ground. Staff? Michael?
Actually, Mr. Chair, I think there's several items of business that we need to take care of. Do you want to?
Yes, so it has recently come to my attention that because our family has one power pole along our property, that there is a possibility of a conflict of interest with respect to the CUP. So I'm going to be recusing myself from this agenda item. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear? Wait.
It's on. Don't push it. It's on.
Can you hear me now? I think it's just not picking.
Having technical
Can-
difficulties.
That's better?
There we go.
Okay, I'm sorry. So it has recently come to my attention that because our family has one power pole along our property that we own, that there is a possibility of a conflict of interest with respect to this issue. And therefore, I'm going to recuse myself from this agenda item. I will be sitting outside
We'll
when,
come out and grab you
Okay.
when we're done.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Whitney.
Mr. Chair, can I just make one?
Yes.
Thing for the record? I just want to make sure all of you, as members of the Planning Commission, I received a letter today at approximately 3:30 from Volt. It is our practice to submit whatever we receive from the public to each one of you, even though this is not a public hearing, so you have that letter, and so it will be part of the public record today. Just to give you an outline of kind of what the letter is, there's reference and concern with calculations of severance damages in the condemnation. And it appears that Volt has approached an appraiser at this point, but they do not have anything concrete that they can present to the commission that you would be really able to consider as far as evidence goes. They're requesting a continuance tonight. I don't think that there is a basis for that. If they had potentially had the information available, possibly, but I don't believe that there is one. I do want to make part of the public record, however, that once the recommendation is given by the Planning Commission this evening, that this will come up before the county or the city council, and the information that they would need to provide can be provided there. It's not like this vote is going to settle and they'll never have an opportunity to do it. They just have not presented anything that can be considered from an evidentiary standpoint tonight.
Thank you. Okay, now, Michael.
Thank you, Chairman Calder, members of the Planning Commission, members of the public. The city has received an application for a conditional use permit to rebuild the existing Heber Light and Power transmission line along Stringtown Road, also 970 South and Ward's Lane. And also the application includes including Rocky Mountain Power's transmission line on those same poles. This is an item that we first looked at in our June Planning Commission meeting. There was a motion made by the Planning Commission, and I'll discuss that motion and then how the applicant has responded to the items in that motion as I go through this presentation. So I have abbreviated my original presentation a few months ago, but I do have some of those slides just to make sure that all members of the public and get a good background for what's being proposed tonight. So the proposed conditional use permit is to rebuild the existing Heber Light and Power line along the three roads that I mentioned and install Rocky Mountain Power lines on the same poles up to 138 kV. This would establish a transmission line interconnection for the valley. Currently there's one main source of power, which is near the Midway Cemetery, that comes into this valley. Adding the transmission line creates a second point of interconnect from Jordanelle down into Heber Valley, which if there is an emergency or some other situation where we lose power coming in from the west side of the valley, there would be another source of power from the north. So that's strengthening reliability is important. It would also increase capacity in Midway and the surrounding area for the amount of power coming into the valley, which we have been informed in a few years, if there's not more power coming into the valley, there could be the possibility of some blackouts. And so it's important to make sure there is enough power coming into the valley to meet all the needs of the community. There is about 1 mile of transmission line in Midway city limits. It's actually just under a mile. The proposal is to follow the historic route, again along Stringtown Road, Wards Lane, and 970 South. And then pole heights, which we've updated this based off of the information we received from even the notice that was just read by our chair. Pole heights would range from 65 feet to 85 feet, so that's actually lower than what was advertised. And that's because we have more specific information now regarding the proposal. And really this height is dependent on which option is chose. If the lines are above ground or below ground, and if they're above ground, that's what the heights could be. And I'll go into greater detail on those heights. And then distribution lines could be varied. Distribution lines, and I'll explain this, are the lines that go to the individual homes. Those would be buried as part of this proposal by Heber Light and Power, which does affect the overall heights of the poles. So just as some background, Midway adopted the transmission line code the first part of this year on January 15th. Initially, we didn't have anything in our code specific to transmission lines, so as a city, we went through and realized the need was there to adopt a specific code for transmission lines, so that went through the public hearing process and was reviewed by the Planning Commission and recommended to the City Council, who later approved it again on January 15th. And so once we adopt a code, we need to follow what is written in that code as we look at it as a conditional use. So we need to make sure that we stay within the guidelines of the law that's been established, both on the local level and then on the state level. Transmission lines are allowed as a conditional use as part of that code. So as a conditional use, there's certain noticing requirements that need to be followed. There's also guidelines that are followed as a conditional use, which in the staff report that was provided to the Planning Commission, also posted on our website, listed those specific findings that need to be looked at as we go through this process. Some of the concerns received from residents to staff regarding this proposal in general are aesthetics, health, property values, and then potential other options or lack of other options that have been provided. So we'll cover those issues as we go through this. Just on a broader scale also, we have 3 transmission lines within Midway city limits. One is the Judge line, which is west of Homestead Drive. It's a Rocky Mountain power line that runs north and south. Fifth South also has a Heber Light and Power transmission line. It's about 0.8 of a mile. Basically runs from the cemetery straight across Midway on Fifth South to county property near the sewer treatment plant. And then also 970 South, including Wards Lane and Stringtown, we have a Heber Light and Power line that's just under a mile in length that we'll be discussing tonight. So just to show that visually on our map, and I've just shown on this what's in color, so it's within the city limits. So the Judge line that I mentioned, split in the center because there's a section that's in the county. We also have the 500 South line that's shown, and then also the 970 and Wards Lane line here on the very south end of the map. So just some pictures of the line that we'll be talking about tonight. This is the existing 970 South line. So this includes transmission lines on the very top end of the pole, and we have distribution here in the center, and then we have communication, which would be different providers such as CenturyLink or Comcast could be that communication line on the very south, on the very bottom part of the pole. So again, we're talking about those 3 components as we go through this presentation. So another picture of this is showing the corner of 250 West or Street Lane and 970 South. So this is one of the poles that we're looking at. And then along Stringtown Road looking south, this is 970 South. And you can see these are the transmission lines on the left, where here on the right, these are just distribution communication. Stringtown Road looking to the north, and there's the transmission line pole. And then Wards Lane also. And this shows all 3 of those components also. And then regarding existing heights, on the poles there's actually an indicator of how tall the poles are, and really this number, to my understanding, is the overall height of the pole, which there could be 8 feet underground. So take the overall pole height shown and subtract the 8, and that tells you how tall those poles are. and then another one on Stringtown that's listed at 55, and then Highway 113 at 60 feet is what's listed, and 970 South 55 feet, Ords Lane at 65. And so as for the proposal tonight for the conditional use, again, what's proposed is running the line along this green line on the map.
Michael,
Yes.
excuse me, just to clarify while you're talking about, those dimensions, are those, I remember there was some kind of debate, are those the pole length or from ground level? I thought that's pole length excludes how much is being buried. Is that correct?
And so I've got a series of maps that we're coming up to that's going to show all of those heights exactly.
Okay.
And so we'll get into some more detail on that. So tangent poles are the poles where the lines are going the same direction where the lines hit the pole. These generally don't need to be quite as tall, and they don't need to be quite as robust because there's not as much tension on those poles because they're in a straight line. And then there's dead end poles wherever the line makes an adjustment regarding its direction, and those are more robust. And so as we go through this, we'll talk about both those types of poles. So some of the submitted documents in the application, we have an underground transmission cost / feasibility study, transmission lines and property values, a review of the research that was submitted, an EMF, electric, and magnetic fields associated with the use of electric power was submitted to the city. And then another document, Powering Our Future, Summit Wasatch Electrical Plan, Local Planning Handbook was submitted. So all of those are on our website. They were included in the original meeting back in June. And so as we go through the code, so I'm going to specifically talk about some sections of our land use code that was adopted again back in January. So section 13.47D1 talks about the route. So our code prefers transmission lines follow historic routes. So I showed those 3 historic routes that are transmission lines in Midway currently. The proposal before us today is to follow the existing route. Pole height, section 13.47D2. The code prefers the shortest poles allowed by industry standard, but all options should be considered for aesthetics and for harmonizing with the vision of the general plan. And so we'll go through 2 options of poles above ground, and there is a difference in the number of poles that would need to be constructed based off of the height that is allowed. Taller poles may reduce the number of poles required. Shorter poles may require the most amount of poles. And then again, the proposal is to replace existing 55 to 65 foot poles with poles that are 65 to 85 feet in height, and this is above grade, is what that would be, 65 to 85 feet.
But the 55 to 65 is not.
That's the entire pole length, including what's underground. That's my understanding, and I'd be happy if anybody would like to correct that, but that's what I've learned over time. All distribution and possibly communication lines will be buried. So what that means, again, is we've got the 3 components on the existing pole: transmission, distribution, and then communication. So the Heber Light and Power Board has voted to pay for the cost of burying the distribution lines along this route and really through the valley, is my understanding, maybe not completely, but through most of the valley. That does lower the overall height of the poles. And it also declutters the amount of lines that you can see on the poles. And so there's some visuals that help describe that. So that's something that does cost quite a bit of money, and that will have an impact on visually on the community by burying those distribution lines. Now, communication lines, again, those are third parties that are on poles, and there's agreements between the pole owner, which would be Heber Light and Power, and those communication companies. Heber Light and Power has indicated they're willing to install conduit for those communication lines, but it's important that the city and Heber Light and Power work with those different companies to make sure they move their communication lines into that conduit that will be installed for them. So that's something we want to make sure happens, you know, about the same time or at the same time as when any construction happens. But that is something to make sure is on the city's radar to work with those companies. Section 13.47D3 limits the types of poles and focuses on the visual impact. So it says specifically in the code, no galvanized poles or reflective material is allowed. Pole color and material will focus on minimizing the visual impact. So if the transmission lines are not buried and we are looking at poles, then the planning commission and the city council will need to decide what color and material will be those poles for, and looking at the visual impact. So wood poles and metal poles are both options. Now, what's being proposed tonight is we have specific metal poles and wood poles, and I'll show you on the map. But wood poles, in a lot of cases, end up being taller than metal poles. They end up having to reach higher into the sky, and there's some specific reasons for that that I'm sure we'd have somebody explain if needed. If metal poles are chosen, the city may determine the color, so there's some different options regarding the finish for those poles, and that's something that would need to be considered. And then section 13.47D4 says any reasonable conditions may be imposed. So that's really with a conditional use permit, per state law, they're really allowed uses with reasonable conditions. So that's what needs to be determined by Planning Commission and City Council on this matter. Burial of transmission lines. So section 13.47E allows the city to require burial of transmission lines and distribution lines. So that's something the city can require per code. Applications state that distribution communication lines will be buried. Again, communication, that's something that's not completely in Heber Light and Power's hands, but we'll need to work with those different entities to make sure those are buried. If transmission lines are required to be buried, costs must be considered, and the city or some other source must pay the difference in cost, and that cost must be paid within 30 days after construction has commenced. So that's something that actually comes up fairly quickly in the process if the lines are to be buried. There is a limited amount of time to pay the difference in cost. So that does create some complications on finding the funds and getting those funds ready if that is the option that's chosen by the city. So some of the different components of the motion from June Planning Commission meeting. Alternative route study is mentioned in the motion. Also provide cost and size of easements, and then easement locations, visual impacts, number and height of poles, and then property lines. So those are all the things listed in the motion, so we'll go over those. And some of these things are shown on the same maps, and I've got quite a series of maps to go through. And so feel free to ask questions as we go through this. So regarding pole height and number of poles, so option A that is in your Planning Commission packet, plus what was listed on the city's website, shows 16 poles. They're 70 to 85 feet in height, and there's 6 still poles and 10 wood poles. So the still poles are those really dead end poles whenever there's a change in direction, and then the wood poles are the tangent poles. And then option B is 21 poles that are 65 feet to 83 feet in tall. And again, there's 6 steel poles and 15 wood poles. And so you can see the difference between option A with less poles and the height slightly greater, at least the overall height, again with the less poles. Then option B has more poles, but they're not quite as tall. So that's the difference between the two, and we can look at that as we go through the maps. Then option C is the underground, burying the lines underground, and there's a series of maps for that also. Regarding the first issue in the motion, alternative route study, our code does prefer the transmission lines follow historic routes. There has been a transmission line along this route for decades, and the proposal does follow that existing route. And so that's what's proposed. That appears to be following our ordinance that's in place. And so that's how that was addressed with the first item in the motion. One of the other items is cost and size of easements, and so there is a spreadsheet that's been provided. It's been provided in the staff report that was provided by the applicant. And this shows those three different options regarding, again, cost and size of easements. There's the short span, the long span, and then the underground. And it shows the roads where the transmission line is proposed to run and currently runs. And it shows the difference in the prescriptive easement as compared to the easement that would be required for each of these different options. So for the short span, along Stringtown, 970 east, 970 west, Wards Lane, what it was submitted was 13,123 feet of additional easement that would need to be acquired. What was submitted to the city also is a fee acre price of 150,000 with purchasing of that easement. So this would be real property purchased at 150,000, where a fee would be 50% of that value, which comes to an estimated cost of just over $22,000. For the long span, also listed are, again, the easements that would be required above and beyond the prescriptive easement in place at just about 15,000 square feet. Again, with the same acre price, and then using the 50% of the fee, that total comes to just under $26,000. And regarding underground, which requires less easement area, that would be 2,574 square feet, using the same acre price and percent of fee. That total comes down to $4,431. So again, that's what was submitted to the city regarding that motion item.
Michael,
Michael, could you please explain to us why there's a 50% of fee? That's how it's calculated?
So what was explained to me is if an acre in this zone, in this area, is worth $150,000 on improved ground, maybe improved ground, I don't know that answer. Just purchasing the easement for the transmission line would be 50% of that value.
Okay.
Michael, what on the square footages that were calculated, that was based on a prescriptive, existing prescriptive easement width of how many feet?
So I've got the maps that'll show that exact item, and it'll show exactly where the easements are. And that's in the packet, but we'll look at those maps.
Yeah, the packet didn't show the total width.
Yeah, and I
So-
may have to refer to Rocky Mountain Power on the width of their prescriptive easement, and then also the easement they're gonna need depending on how tall the pole is. So that does vary, obviously, between the three options.
And just quick, I apologize, to go back to the first item that was requested from the Planning Commission is an alternate route study. Clearly, we have other routes where existing power lines are going. That clearly wouldn't preclude them from demonstrating or showing or exploring alternative studies. Why did they come back with no alternative study?
So the thought, looking at the ordinance, this is a historic route, and looking at the pure language of the ordinance, which is what state code requires us to do, is look at the clear and plain language of our code. It was determined that this is a historic route, and that's what we're proposing to follow.
I understand, but the commission had asked for an alternative route study to be done. So the applicant came back and basically is saying they don't need to prepare one?
Yes, because they're following that historic
They're
route.
following the ordinance.
Yep, our code.
Our request was at odds with our code.
Yep.
You know, we felt that it exceeded the scope of the code.
Yep.
And so, because they're complying with the code, that request seemed to be beyond what it is that we can reasonably legally request.
That makes sense. Corbin, could you explain, I understand why Heber Light and Power does not have to provide us with an alternate route study. Heber Light and Power was not asked to provide us with an alternate route study. Rocky Mountain Power was. Why, if they do not have an existing easement, are they exempt from providing us with a alternate route study?
So the question really is, we have a code in place,
Yes.
okay? And it says that we prefer to have them propose that where we have existing transmission lines, which is what they did. And so requesting them to do an alternative route study where they're complying with what we're saying in our code could potentially be seen as going beyond what we can legally ask for. And is it even realistic that we would ask for that? Where else would they be able to put the line? And so it seems to me that it's just beyond anything that would be the scope of what should be considered here.
Okay, so there are a series of different maps we'll look at, and kind of the key to these maps is looking up here at the top. So this is option A, which is the short spans. And this is showing, and it's probably difficult on this scale to be able to see a lot of detail. We did provide the larger maps in the Planning Commission packet, 11 by 17, so hopefully you'll be able to see some of those details. So what this shows are the poles, where they would be located as compared to the prescriptive easement, which is shown on here, also the property lines, and then any additional easement also required. And so that's how that calculation was created on the chart we were looking at for the additional easement, was off of these maps.
Again, these maps were provided by the applicant. Can we just quickly ask the applicant what the assumed prescriptive easement width that they're assuming?
They say up there,
Well-
so under the option A, it says existing is 27 foot from center line, and then it says what the new one is. And that's consistent. If you look at these maps, there's also little hatched areas on the sides that indicate where that exceeds the prescriptive easement, what's there now. So if you look on other, this one doesn't have a lot because there's only a foot and a half difference, but other ones it shows like where it may be going 4.5 to 8 feet or whatever. You can see that in others, but that's where that's called out and identified.
Mr. Chairman, I actually have a question about that.
Okay, Commissioner Streeter has a question.
In the previous meetings, Heber Light and Power represented that their easement was 25 feet wide. The way it is stated here is that they're saying that the existing right-of-way is 27 feet from center line. That is not what was represented in the last meeting. And when you clarify that, can you also clarify, here it says for the 138 kV right-of-way, that the easement would be 28.5 feet from center line, yet in the last meeting, Rocky Mountain Power stated that they, I can't remember if it was by law or by policy, had a minimum of 60, but we're requesting 65. And if Rocky Mountain Power and/or Heber Light and Power can, at some point in this meeting, explain the discrepancy, I would appreciate it.
Okay, and take note of that. I'd prefer to let Michael finish his presentation, and then we'll offer an opportunity for the proponent to address any questions like that the commission might have in due time.
All right, thank you. So for each one of these three options, option A, option B, and option C, we have a series of maps. There's 4 maps with each of these different options. So this is one of 4. And we also have the Lord's Lane and the Stringtown Road map. And shows the property lines, prescriptive easement, needed easement for the change that's being proposed. And then also, this would be along 970 on the west map with the short spans, and then also 970 on the east section of showing the short spans. So that's the first series of maps that creates the easement number.
Hey, Michael, go back on that 970, as I was looking through it, it doesn't appear to me that the new pole location accommodates the roadway now.
It does not.
Yeah, so With the Saddle Creek subdivision,
Yep.
they're required to widen out 970 south along this entire length. And so, because of that widening, the pole location will not be the same as where it currently is. So those poles will all be to the north, so the map does need to.
Do we know how far north they would move?
I don't know the exact number, I don't know what that exact number is.
I've got an idea, 15 feet.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That could be plus or minus a couple of feet.
Michael, also what could be helpful as you go through this with each alternative is and maybe you have that shown side-by-side comparison as a total number of poles existing versus proposed.
They're actually on the map.
Is that on the map?
Yeah.
I apologize. Okay.
And there's a couple of other maps too that also show the wood and steel poles, so we'll go over that.
Okay.
So option B, again, following the same route, this is the long spans, and this shows a lesser amount of poles. There's more easement that's required because the poles are taller. And so again, this shows same information, property lines, restricted easement, and then required easement for this height of poles. Again, showing the existing prescriptive at 27.5 feet from center line, and what's required is 29 feet from center line. And again, it's the corner of Wards Lane and Stringtown, 970 south, and the other side 970 south. And then option C is burying dwellings underground. This requires less of an easement than poles do, and so there's less easement, quite a bit less actually would be required to be acquired for this type of option. And this is showing again 15 feet from center line, and then there's a 30 by 80 foot for the balls is what's required. That's where the box down area
Yep.
is for the balls.
And again, that would change once the widening of 970 south is considered.
And then this map shows different photo simulations being created. We're focusing on these ones down here at the bottom, really number 5. And so this is that location on the map, looking to the east, showing existing conditions. So this is our existing pole on site, again with the communication line, the distribution, and the transmission for heater, light, and power. And then proposed conditions, which does show that those distribution are now buried. So they're not shown on this photo simulation. They're showing the increased height of the poles. And this is the short span view, so this is a greater number of poles along the route as compared to the long span with the taller poles. So again, existing conditions on the top, and I've switched the slide to show the 70-foot long span view. So I'm going to flip back and forth between these two so we can take a look at that. So that's short span, and this is long span. You can see the number of poles have been reduced between the two.
And it's a 5-foot difference in height.
That is
overall.
correct.
Yeah.
So I'll switch back and forth a couple of times. All right, then moving on to proposed conditions, 65-foot short span view, and then proposed conditions for a 70-foot long span view. So this is showing those two side by side that I was flipping back and forth between the two. You can see the difference in how many poles are along the route.
Michael, before you get going too far, if you look at existing conditions and proposed conditions,
Okay,
Is
so this
there-
one here.
is there a change in the material that the upper cross pieces are made out of?
And so, and this is gonna be something that Rocky Mountain Power will have to address, but you're referring to the pole itself?
Because if you look at the existing condition,
Yeah?
the short side pieces are much more visible, not the bottom one, because I understand that's local
It's these ones
distribution.
here.
those higher ones are much more visible there than any crossbar and the others. And I'm wondering, is that
Could be distance.
a fluke or is that reality?
Yeah, we'll have to have them address that particular question.
Okay.
Now, as for what these poles are made of, these tangent poles are all wood poles on the photo simulations. Existing poles are wood. Whenever we have a dead end pole is where we have a steel pole. So we'll go through a map on that also.
Sorry, Jim, I'm kind of exploding.
So just looking at this is the map of the entire stretch within Midway City. This is the typical span length proposal, so it's a span length of 300 feet to 395 feet. There's 16 total structures, and the structure height above ground is 70 to 85 feet. So these are the taller poles, and it's really difficult to see, but basically there's a steel pole on the end here. There's also one down on the corner of Stringtown and Woods Lane, another one at the corner of 970 and Stringtown. And we have two in the center of 970 where there's a change in direction. The line goes from the north side to the south side of the road. So there's a steel one located right by Snake Creek, and then another one right at the corner of 250 West and 970. And then there's also one at the very end at 970 where it hits Highway 113.
What would be helpful, and this is probably directed at the applicant, maybe in their discussion here, is to basically, I understand the corner ones are going to be higher. For all others, basically, what is the maximum height of the all others? Rather than just a range mixing the two together of 70 to 85 feet, it would be helpful to know, for example, if the corner ones are 85, if the other ones range from 70 to 75 feet.
This identifies every pole.
Yeah.
Every single
I-
pole is called out in there.
I understand that. But just in summary,
Just in summary,
it doesn't summarize.
So going through the map,
Rather than have to look through and identify what is the tallest non-corner.
yeah. So I can
Pole.
just go through each one of them, but this one on the very end is 70 feet. The tangent poles, the wood poles here are 75 feet. The pole on the corner, Wards Lane and Stringtown, that one is 73 feet.
Yep.
We have a tangent pole in between, 75 feet, and then the corner pole down on 970 and Stringtown is 81 feet. And then we have a tangent pole that's 80 feet. The next one by Snake Creek is 75 feet. And then the next pole on the corner of 250 West and 970 is 72 feet. And those two, yeah, that's correct. Those two are still the one by Snake Creek and the one at the corner. And then we have three tangent poles. The first one's 75 feet, one in the middle is 75 feet, and then the one closest to 113 is 80 feet. And then the end pole is 85 feet, which is a steel pole. And then as for the shorter poles, and again, there's 21 of these where there were 16 on what we just went over. 70 feet for the end pole, which is a steel pole. Then there's a tangent of poles that are wood, and those are all 65 feet. The corner pole on Wards and Stringtown is 71 feet, and that's a steel pole. Then there's two wood poles. One is 65 feet, the other one's 75 feet, so the southern one is 75. Then there's the corner pole, which is Stringtown and 970, which is a steel pole at 81 feet. Then we have a tangent pole, which is a wood pole at 80 feet. The dead end pole at right where the creek is located is a steel pole, and it's 70, looks like 75 or 60 per reed. 75 feet. And then there's also a steel pole at the corner of 250 and 970, which is 72 feet. there's a series of tangent poles, 4 of them, that are wood, 70 feet, 70 feet, 70 feet, and then 75 feet for the one that's farthest to the east. And then the pole just on the far side of 113 is a steel pole at 83 feet.
Yeah, Michael, I know the burying the lines is extremely expensive and it's not worthwhile probably on the side streets, but this route, we have Stringtown Road and then we also have going over Center Street, which to my mind are connector roads. Do we know what and I apologize because it might have been in that original packet, the cost to bury the lines along Stringtown and the 2 poles that basically go over Center Street? Because based on what that cost might be, maybe the city would be, think that would be worthwhile to bury those.
So your thought is that some of this line would be above ground and some would be below?
Yes.
I've heard overall numbers for what it would cost to bury
Mm-hmm.
in the city limits, but I haven't heard specifics for going above ground and below ground
Right.
in different segments. So we probably have to, I'm not sure the study went to that depth to say exactly what it would be.
Okay. Because along Stringtown, I think it's 641 feet is the length along there.
Yeah.
And obviously going across Center, you just have the 2 poles, one on each side.
So your thought is under the arterial road, we bury it so it wouldn't be as visible?
Yes.
And then the collector road of Stringtown also maybe do the same thing there?
Well, no, along Stringtown and going where it goes across Center, we would bury it.
So just those?
Just those 2.
Just that spot? Yeah, I don't think the study went to that detail. We'd have to
Mhm.
look into that, but, that's something to consider.
Right, because if it came out to $100 a lot in additional property tax, might be worth it.
Quick question, Michael. So my understanding is that 970 South, upon its widening, will at that point be regarded as a collector road as well. Is that correct?
So on our master road plan, yeah, once that road is built out, it's built out to a collector standard,
Okay, so,
a local collector standard. That's actually different from a collector, but it's local collector.
I guess this is what I'm trying to ascertain. Looking forward, if we follow Commissioner Ream's recommendation, what streets are we looking at that are going to be deemed collector roads where it may be in our best interest to bury versus which ones are not?
So we've got basically 3 different classifications here. We've got an arterial road, which is Highway 113, and we've got a local collector, which is what 970 is planned as. If I remember correctly, Stringtown is a local collector. Does that sound? And then we have a local road, which would be Works Lane. So those are all different classifications. We need to decide what classification we're to bury based off of that. what
Okay.
state.
Sorry, just wanted to.
Yeah, no, it's more, as people are coming into Midway, and let's say we're just talking about arterials, it would be nice not to have that visual impact.
Yeah.
So could we get, maybe just for the arterial then, those 2 poles, bury it going under Center Street and have the poles back far enough so they're not overly visible?
Yeah, we could definitely ask that of the applicants.
Okay.
See what the potential could be for doing that.
So the last pole to the east, the one that's right next to Center Street,
So there-
that's actually where it goes into the county, right?
Yeah, that does.
So the only thing we could require at least is going down, you'd have a pole right next to Center Street, and everything on the east you'd have it, and then you can go under for however far you'd want on this side, but you'd still have that pole sitting there unless the applicant was willing to,
Yeah.
and we'd
So
probably have to pay for it still,
we
but
would-
to
we
bury
would
the
end up
stuff on the
paying for
west
that.
too.
The situation. If
So-
we asked for it to be buried, we'd pay the difference.
Okay.
But, a smaller section would cost
Yeah.
less than what we've seen for the whole distance, so that's something to consider. documents provided to us, there were some questions in our last meeting in June about vegetation and the impact of properties along the route. So there's been some photos submitted to the city that shows some existing situations for 46 kV to 138 kV rights of way with vegetation. And I don't know exactly where these are located, so we have to refer to the applicant. But now this is kind of an urban setting. We've got a church on the left here, and there's some trees planted underneath the transmission line. So some vegetation is allowed underneath the poles. There are some limitations on the height, for instance. So this is an example of that. And then this is another one with some vegetation in really a suburban area. So this is kind of a hilly area, and you can see some trees that have been planted below. This is another, looks like this is the same pole from a different view. Another example of vegetation, some taller vegetation off to the side, and another situation where there's trees underneath the transmission line. And then another example. And these are some that are here in right next to our city. So this looks like it's the Judge line over here on the West Hill. And then this was provided to the city also, and the applicant may want to talk on this. This shows a profile, fire zone, border area, and then taller trees to the side. So I've gone through the documents provided. I've gone through the motion. Any questions from the Planning Commission and regarding this? We do have the applicant here that could answer some of the details to their specific proposal. There are some findings that have been provided in your staff report that are listed in front of you. And we have not proposed any conditions yet. That's part of this process, is deciding, first of all, if it does go below ground, then what conditions would be reasonable in that situation. If it is above ground, the determination would be the short span or the high span, which determines the height of the poles and the number of poles. And then the next item would be what those metal poles would look like, what the finish would be. The wood poles would be what they are, but as for the metal poles, there's different finishes that could be chosen regarding those steel poles. So that's kind of the route of decision making, is above ground or below ground, and if it's above ground, what they look like, and how many there are and how tall they are. Are there questions for staff on that?
Okay, before we go to questions for Michael, Corbin, do you have any further comment on the legal aspects of what we're attempting to do here tonight before we go into the questions and discussion?
Yeah, let me just kind of walk through the law once again. Conditional use permit is a permitted use in all of our zones, so these are allowed. State law says that they shall be approved, and the city has the right to impose reasonable conditions to mitigate the negative impacts. It's mitigation, not removal. So if the applicant has proven by preponderance of the evidence that they have reasonably tried to mitigate the impact, then the law requires approval of the application. Reasonable conditions in this particular analysis would involve the height of the poles, the span of the poles, the type of pole, wood or metal, and then the finish on the pole is the reasonable areas of work that you could be discussing. And then lastly, this commission could decide if they want to bury the pole or bury the lines, but in making that recommendation, you have to understand that we pay the difference, right? And we have to come up with that money within 30 days to start. So those are kind of the ways that you kind of walk through here. So that's really the scope of what it is that you're here to determine. And so based on that, I'll let you guys do your job.
Thank you, Corbin. Now, We'll open it up for discussion with the commission. Please feel free to ask any questions of staff. When you feel like we need to ask the proponent to come forward for questions, let me know and we'll allow him to come forward.
Just a quick question from Michael, were property owners they required to be noticed within the proposed
Yeah, let me go
line?
through the noticing requirements
Okay.
for this item. So this is a conditional use in our code. So noticing requirements for conditional use are dependent on if it's a public hearing or just a public meeting. So both planning commission meetings that we've had, the previous one and this one, were actually just public meetings. They're not required by code to be a public hearing, which means we take comment from the public. We did go the extra mile and notice everybody within 600 feet along the route in the June meeting. So that wasn't required by code, but we did end up noticing everybody for that meeting along the route. Again, tonight is a public meeting, but not a public hearing, so it wasn't a required notice regarding a letter to everybody along the route. And we are required to notice it on the state website, also on our local website. We also notice it around town in 3 public locations. And we also notice it in our local newspaper. So we did make sure that those items were met. As for the public hearing that's required through the conditional use process, that happens at the city council level. So we will send out another series of letters that will have to be sent out 10 days before the public hearing. And so whenever a recommendation is made by the planning commission, when we know the date of that city council meeting, we'll send out those letters and invite all the neighbors within 600 feet to come participate in that public hearing.
Michael, could you clarify if when you say that we have to provide notice, is that Midway City or is that the applicant?
So when we receive an application, in order to have that application on a city council meeting or a public or a planning commission meeting, depending on the type of application it is, as part of the application, we require the applicant to give us the names and addresses of everybody who's within the noticing distance. And then as a city, we make sure that those letters are sent out at least 10 days before the meeting.
Do we have any procedure for when people don't get noticed?
And so what you are stating.
I've had people complain to me that they did not get noticed.
Yeah. And periodically, we get letters back that are undeliverable, for instance, so we just put those in the file. We require the applicant to give us a list of all of those who are going to receive a letter. And we make sure that we have an envelope for each one of those on the list. And we do spot checks. We don't check every single one to make sure that everybody's on the list, but we make sure that it looks reasonable. And we haven't found any problems with people being missed. But that is something that we do spot check.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, do you know how many existing poles there are along the route to compare to the 16
Yeah.
and 21?
So there's a map that shows the existing poles. I can't see the number right offhand.
Okay.
16.
There's 16.
21.
So, related to that, on some of the areas, especially down the corner when it goes by Center Street, there's a lot more where there's proposed 2 or 3.
Yeah.
There's like 4 or 5. Those are all going away, right? Everything in the path that we're talking about, all those poles that are existing are going away except the ones in the plan, correct?
So one of the advantages of a change is we have a lot of extra poles along the route, and some of those are distribution line poles. And if those distribution lines are buried, then we actually reduce the number of poles along the route.
Okay.
And so just looking at the quantity of poles, that would reduce. We need to need to make sure those communication lines are buried, which should be
Okay.
questioned.
So they should be buried, everything in that.
Yeah.
So if my count is correct, I counted 24 along this route.
Yeah, that's what I
For
counted.
information. So
Yep.
existing poles. So both these plans actually reduce the number of poles.
So we have a choice between 16 or 21 poles, really?
With the proposal,
With the
yeah,
proposal.
the existing pole number would reduce.
Yep.
Okay,
I had a question for, so earlier you said when the metal versus wood, that metal sometimes can get shorter. I understand, especially in the corner conditions, that's true. On the tangent poles, would they be any shorter doing, maybe this is more of a question for the applicant, would they be any shorter if they were metal in that case, or is that purely just based on clearances
Yeah, I think,
for what was
my
proposed?
understanding is generally a wood pole is taller than a metal pole. And so it's possible that those tangent poles could be less, but we'll have to have them address that.
And also, along that lines, the difference in diameter between the two. If it's substantial or not.
Yeah, that is a technical question. We'll have to ask them what the
Okay.
diameter will be based off the two different types of poles. Really the three wood, the dead end poles are going to be much wider diameter.
Okay. So, do we have any additional questions for staff? Okay, is there someone here from Rocky Mountain Power that could come forward and address any questions that the commission has regarding the technical issues that have been raised? I remind you, I'm not asking you for a statement. I'm just asking you to address questions. Thank you. So, commission, have at 'em.
Well, I think there's some outstanding ones already about the diameter, wood, metal, et cetera.
Do you want us to compile a list of questions and have you walk through them?
I jotted down a couple of them.
Okay.
If you want me to read off what I
Yeah,
jotted down,
yeah.
make sure that matches up.
That'd be great, thank you.
And if you just let me know if you want me to refer to your presentation, I do have my map, so just direct me where you want me to go.
If you could open up the presentation that we send over, I think there's a table in there that it might be helpful to refer to.
Okay. Do you know roughly how far down that is?
I don't know the number.
Okay.
Just keep scrolling. A lot of this is the same information as you mentioned. Yeah, right here. Is it possible to zoom into that at all?
Okay, do we know what page that is on our packet?
It is in it.
It's in
It is.
It's in the other one.
It was
Oh.
in the original.
Do we know what page it is in the original?
And for purposes of the record, can you just real quick state your name and who you represent?
I'm Benjamin Clegg, I'm with Rocky Mountain Power. And one of the questions came up on if there was a way to see sort of a summary of the differences between the long span and the short span, and differences in poles and heights and all of those things. And so that's what this table does. It's broken out. You see that at the top in the columns you have sections. So 970 south, starting on the east side of the line, starting at 970 south, center and 250 west, and then down 250 west, then 970 to Ward's Lane along Stringtown, and then down Ward's Lane. And then in the rows, the first 4 rows are for the shorter span, and the second 4 rows is the longer span, and then you can see its structure number, pole height, pole material, and span feet. Can you not hear me? Thank you. And so, looking from a summary perspective along these sections, if you want to compare sort of quickly in each section from 970 south on the eastern portion of it, the short span has 6 poles. You can see the first one still, last one being wood. The longer span has 4 poles. You can see the pole heights as well as the material and the span lengths. The next section along 970 is 250 west of Stringtown. And regardless of long span, short span, because with the jog in the road, those designs are actually identical. And you mind scrolling over to the right a little bit. Then going down Ward's Lane, you can see that one pole is eliminated on a longer span. You can see the pole heights and differences in span lengths. And then down to Ward's Lane, you can see the difference, and there's 2 fewer poles.
Ben, while you're on that,
Yeah.
so what is the difference between the bottom pole diameter, wood versus metal, generally?
So just to clarify, understand the question correctly, for a pole that does a similar purpose, so a tangent pole to a tangent to a tangent would, because usually you would use steel to
carry an angle, all the loads associated with turning the line.
Right.
So if you're talking about a tangent pole,
Yeah, say a tangent versus tangent.
you know, Nicole, I'll defer to you because you're a better expert at this. I think the wood pole is a little bit larger, but nominally so, a few inches. But Nicole's the transmission engineer, and she knows that better than I do.
So Nicole Kendall, transmission engineering with Rocky Mountain Power. To answer your question, they would be very similar diameters in terms of wood and steel. If they were both a tangent structure, you're not going to see much of a difference.
Similar as in,
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but they're not going to be any bigger than the poles you see on Highway 40 right now.
The smaller
The smaller ones, not the big angle structures, but in terms of diameter,
Yeah, there's actually even on the narrow ones,
So,
there's
okay,
a
so-
substantial difference, so.
let me rephrase the question. There's metal poles on Highway 40, right, that replaced wood poles. What's the diameter of those?
I'd have to look that up. I don't have that information with me at the moment.
So what's class poles are you talking about on the wood poles? Class 1, H1, H2?
So right now, they're class ones.
It would be about 20 inches in diameter at the ground level.
Is that what the existing poles are, or what the new?
Poles would be.
Okay. Any estimate as to what the existing ones are?
Probably about 18 inches.
Okay, but not substantially, as you
We're
said.
talking about inches here. We're not talking about, like, going up pole class, you're going a couple of inches, and even pole class to pole class. In each one, you might have one that's 20 inches, you might have one that's 22 inches. It's a wood pole, so you're going to have some differences in diameter pole to pole. The other thing, kind of germane to the steel pole question, and I forget which planning commission member asked it, but the question was asked about height of poles, metal to wood, how the wood poles are slightly taller. That is true that they are slightly taller, although one thing to consider with this is that the location in the air where the insulators are holding those conductors is the same regardless if it's steel or wood. The difference is from the insulator, the top insulator, to the top of the pole. So those conductors and insulators that hold the wire would be more or less at the exact same location.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there any way to eliminate the steel poles? Yeah, is that an option?
More poles.
There's more poles and more facilities and more, I mean, I can't tell you what you call an impact, but
Yeah.
oftentimes additional guys are considered additional impacts. And so typically we would use a steel pole. You require additional poles, additional guy anchors to do that. It is theoretically possible.
I mean, so the big steel ones are they're just so unsightly. I just wonder if, and I don't know if I have a preference, but it just seems like if we had alternatives to those big, huge tree trunk steel poles, that maybe the residents would prefer that.
I think
And along that same question is to understand, at least what the alternative of that would be, is if you did do wood with the guy wires, is the height and diameter of the wood going to be similar to the other poles?
Yeah.
The tangent poles, excuse me?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
you might experience. I'll defer to Nicole rather than.
So in order to get rid of the steel, you're going to need 2 wood poles with down guys and anchors. So you're going to need all that additional right of way as well. Being as all the corners are on street corners, you're going to have to guide to a stub pole across the street in 2 directions, and you're going to need 2 poles per angle instead of just 1 now.
Yeah.
So the dead ends, the wood guide structures are going to be H3s, H4s. at that point, so they're gonna be bigger.
So you have the wooden pole plus 2 guy poles per
Yeah,
each?
so you'll
Each
have-
direction.
You'll bring in, so you have 2 circuits on 1 pole right now.
Mhm.
So to turn a corner with wood poles, you have to separate the circuits and go 1 circuit per pole, so you have 2 poles plus 2 sets of guying for each structure, for each structure, for each.
So there'd be 6 poles
To turn that
instead of 1.
Mm-hmm.
I think steel poles are a
6
lot more
poles?
attractive than having
Yeah,
a
I
bunch
didn't-
of wires. And the guy wires, they're very unattractive and more impactful to the property owners,
Yeah,
quite
I
frankly,
just didn't
because,
know what the
yeah, well, the
options were.
angle's sticking down.
Well,
You have a question?
Do you have this, do you know this picture if I reference it from your packet?
Somewhere,
You
but I
mean the
can.
location of where it is, or just the photo in general?
Well, just the photo in general, because I trust what you're saying, but I'm also looking at this photo, which is a wooden pole approximately the same size as a tangent pole that is on a corner, and it's just guide. So I'm just a little unclear of the photo you provided us with versus what you're saying. What's the difference in application, or what are we seeing here?
It's coming down a hill, so you might have uneven faces on the line.
If I'm thinking about the photo correctly, so right now, all of the existing structures are a single circuit, so there's only 1 transmission circuit on there. Do you mind if I?
No, you can,
borrow it?
you are more than welcome to borrow it. Sorry, it's just the left-hand photo?
So this is a single circuit corner structure.
Okay.
So you have the guides in one direction. From the photo, it's hard to see, but going across the street, you have guy wires to another pole that are then guyed and anchored into the ground that you cannot see in this photo.
So that's actually a 2-pole
Yes,
structure, okay.
yes it is.
Sorry,
And-
but I
And
need
again, in
you to kind of
comparison-
clarify questions.
the corner pole in metal is what diameter at the ground?
So that depends on the loads on the pole and then the type of soil it's in, which are factors that
So
you have to work out.
the one on Highway 40, I mean, it appears to be, I'm guesstimating, rough guess, it appears to me to be like 5 to 6 feet in diameter at the bottom. Or maybe more, I don't know.
5 to 6 feet for the type of application we're talking about is very typical for a double circuit corner structure. That's a big 90-degree angle, like we're talking about here.
So what finishes are available for the steel poles?
So currently, right now in the industry, you can do a galvanized pole, which is a gray. They can also do a doling process, which makes it more of a kind of a darker gray color, and it's not so shiny. There's also self-weathering steel, which is the rusty brown color.
Which is on Highway 40.
That's what
Yes. Mhm. So those are the 2 current, not coatings, but current steel that you can purchase right now in the industry.
Okay, I have a question as the person who goes down to Las Vegas, where surprisingly, there's a lot of power poles. Down there, I see an awful lot of poles that have a coloring, well, it's almost an absence of coloring to them. So that if you've been to Las Vegas, by the afternoon, all the contrails turn the sky kind of whitish. And so a lot of the power poles are kind of whitish. Are you saying that finish is not available?
So a lot of those finishes are a lead-based paint, which we're not allowed to use anymore for environmental standards.
So when we see poles that have a color to them, that's just not available anymore?
Not anymore.
Okay.
Because they're lead-based paint, unfortunately, and the EPA has come in and fixed that, so.
Okay.
Are there any of these, the
It's out there
gold
chewing on those
finished
poles.
poles in the local area that we could see in person?
Not here in the Heber Valley locally, but there's a great number of them in the Salt Lake Valley.
Okay. It's just, it's still galvanized, it's just a darker, duller.
Yeah, it's a duller gray, so it's not so shiny.
Yeah.
It's kind of like non-spectral wire, where they dull the wire so it's not shiny. It's the same type of finish.
Okay, Nicole, don't go anywhere. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Michael when we were looking at the renderings. We have, the existing picture where you can see the cross pieces. They're very visible. And then you have a rendering where the cross pieces, if I'm using that term correctly,
So they're insulators.
insulators. I don't speak engineer. Is that an accurate representation?
So the existing insulators that are out there right now are a dark porcelain. The new insulators are gonna be a gray polymer. So rendering wise, they may be a little darker, but they're not gonna be as dark as the porcelain is out there right now.
Okay, all right, thank you. Continuing through my list. 970 South will be widened. Is that going to, and Mr. Clegg, this might actually be a question for you. I'm not quite sure who would answer this. Is the widening of 970 South, which is going to push the poles on 970 South to the north by, West says approximately 15 feet, is that going to affect the number of dead-end poles, tangent poles? Are we going to see any difference because of the widening?
Answer that in two parts. The first one is as this project was first contemplated, we identified that road would ultimately be widened, and had a few conversations with staff. At the time, there wasn't any projects that were actively being pursued, and knowing which direction it was going to go and moving things along, it wasn't really something that was real at the time. So we proceeded with our application the way that it is because there wasn't an active project. The second part of your question is actually an Nicole question I have her answer.
So moving them north, there may be one additional small angle structure that has to be utilized. So one of the tangent structures maybe have converted to a small angle, but otherwise the number would stay the same.
Okay. And then lastly, one of the, well, sorry, it's not entirely lastly, it's lastly on this list. On your render, or your maps, you show, existing poles and proposed poles. One thing that exists right now is that our roads aren't very wide. And that creates a bit of a traffic problem. If you have a pole too close to a road or a driveway, anybody who is driving, say, a truck, like a pickup truck with a trailer or anything larger, has difficulty navigating the corner without getting terribly up close and personal with your power poles. Given that on sheet 1, you have one proposed, I can't tell, how close is that to the, are we going to have problems on this one? And then, again, same question on sheet 4.
Is this the short span maps that you're looking at, or the long
These are the short span maps.
short span maps?
Option A, sheet 1. Okay, see on the Whitewater Way, on the west of Whitewater Way.
So someone turning left there.
Yeah, I can't look at this and have any sense of scale. I mean, do we have any idea how close that's actually?
If you would, quite frankly, if you would like to propose a condition that we work with your engineering department to make sure that site triangles and intersections are appropriate for the locations, I think that would be a reasonable thing that we would agree to in final placement of those poles to ensure that the site triangles are right as well as radiuses.
My question is, though, if we do that, if we sit there and say, hey, you've got to move this pole this way, this pole that way, is that going to affect our pole numbers and pole heights in any way?
It shouldn't.
Okay.
I mean, as long as we're not talking dozens and dozens of feet, you know, if we're talking.
No, these are all fairly short. They'll all just be essentially corrections. My guess is maximum would be 8 feet.
Yeah, you know, 5 to 10 feet, that's an easy shift, and it won't change the number or the height.
Okay, all righty.
Michael, quick question.
You
Stringtown.
Still have more?
Is there any, this will kind of may or may lead to a question here. Stringtown Road, is the street width dedication here that's shown, the total street dedication that we would want in the future for Stringtown, or is there some plan to increase the width of Stringtown in the future?
Or add trails or something like that.
Right. In other words, does their plan take all of that consideration and would accommodate that?
So Stringtown Road, that's planned as a collector road. What we planned on our trail plan are bike lanes up and down both sides of Stringtown in the long run. As for the width, Wes may want to chime in. We don't have a center turn lane plan for that road for the time being, but that may be something we look at is if there's any new roads added to make sure we have a safe left-hand turn lane into side roads. So those are the things we'd want to take a look at regarding the width.
Because wouldn't the location of the proposed line have an impact on our ability to make any type of improvements down the road?
It would, depending on how close it is to existing pavement and then planned width for the road.
So on the plan, in that specific thing, it says 66 feet right there. Is that the roadway right of width? Or right of way for the roadway? Is that what that 66 represents?
That's correct.
So with that 66 feet, I mean, we're not gonna go wider than that, are we?
I wouldn't anticipate us acquiring additional right-of-way. I could see in the future widening the existing asphalt within the right-of-way. I don't see Midway being able to afford to go down through there and purchase right-of-way. Each time we get a development, we require them to dedicate the 66 feet, which is what the current homes are. So I think we'd widen in the existing right-of-way when we do.
So do you see an issue with those poles at all in relationship to that question, given that they're just at the edge of that 66-foot right-of-way?
No, I think we'll be fine.
And trails
And
aren't
trails?
impacted by the placement of poles?
Again, probably not, because we would improve within our right-of-way. I don't see us acquiring additional right-of-way for trails or road widening.
So all of their proposed pole locations are out of the public right-of-way?
If they're on the right-of-way line.
Okay.
I think the one thing to take note of is this pole right here with 970. That does look like it could be problematic.
The future plan is that this existing 970 roadway be widened, tying into the proposed widening of 970. So you could see this roadway width right away going east. Yes, that would be problematic through there.
Well, but going, okay, looking right here, this line, the second line, not this line where they're calling the proposed easement line. This line right here, I read that as the Stringtown right-of-way, 33 feet, which means these poles right here are inside.
I think
The
actually
right of
you're
way.
reading their right-of-way, their existing right-of-way, not Stringtown's.
No, I think what they're
Well, you're
saying
looking-
is
It says
that
Stringtown Road
33
right
feet
away.
from the center line, giving us a 66-foot full right-of-way width.
Right,
But yeah, where those
If-
arrows
if-
are showing, it looks like they are
if-
inside that
If the city's Stringtown right-of-way is a total of 66 feet in width, these poles are inside of it.
Whatever final plan they come up with will be on the right-of-way line, I'm certain.
But this-
So what we proposed is to follow the existing alignment through that section, follow what existing poles are. Again, I'll go back to my statement before, you know, if there's some grand plan that is known today, we're happy to work with the engineering department, on, specific pole placements. But, we operate within the information that we have available when we file the application.
And I think what the city would ask is that we establish right-of-way line, and that's where the new poles be installed in. And I think you're gonna find that's very close to where they are.
Well, there's a difference, scale-wise, they've got to be close to 8 feet inside the right-of-way.
Well, I would suggest in our motion that one of the conditions be that the poles be located outside of the street right away.
Or right on the.
Or right on the right of way line, yeah.
Since we have this drawing up here, if I could, one of the questions revolves around landscaping, what can and can't be done within the easement. And because I'm familiar, I live off of Stringtown further south, but take, for example, this location here with the tree. I went out there right before the meeting, just took a quick picture to get an idea in the scale of that tree. That tree right there on this corner lot, now this is Ward's Lane and Stringtown, that tree actually towers above the pole height right next. I'm guessing at least 10 feet, probably 10 to 15 feet above the pole height. So if those are 55 to 60 foot poles, that's towering 70 to 75 feet tall. And it's within, I'm just visually, it's within 10 feet of the center line of the existing poles there. So what would have to be done to that tree? So clearly that's a tree that doesn't mature at 25 feet.
Yeah. Our preference would be to prune whatever's there. However, in this case, that's likely not going to be possible. Although that is exactly where the line is today as well, kind of through that same section.
So what would have to be done to the tree? Would that have to be cut down?
Yes, I have to look at that specific tree, but there are likely a handful of trees that will have to be cut down, and we would offer vouchers for trees that will not grow to the same height and cause the same problem.
And now, when it was brought to your attention that trees will have to be cut down, I think your argument was that you don't cut down trees, you do landscape management.
Vegetation management.
Vegetation management was the term you used. Is that correct?
Wait, I'm not following your question.
Okay. The last meeting where this was brought up, I think you had mentioned that you don't cut down trees.
Well, our preference would be to prune trees and not have to cut them all the way down, although there are times where trees that are not congruent with the line are either planted in the line or the line's going there and they will have to be taken.
Okay.
Ideally, we manage the vegetation instead of have to take those out, and I would say even more ideally, trees are planted that don't grow into the line.
Sure, but existing trees, basically all of these trees along here, because their mature height is well above 25, it's more than double that. And all along here would all have to be cut down. Some of these, the trunk is probably, I'm guesstimating 2 to 3 feet in diameter.
Yeah.
Very
one
mature
thing to
trees.
consider with that is there's possibly some vegetation management that needs to happen along the line today. The impact from the new line to the old line, the existing condition is a transmission line, and you have to maintain clearance from that same tree as it sits today. So the impact from what's being proposed versus what's there today is very similar. It's an overhead transmission line. You have to prune those trees, or in some cases, if they get too big, they have to be removed and something else planned.
I'd like to remind the commission that we're not trying to set up a debate society. We're just after information, so.
So I have a question. This is actually Natalie's question earlier. Can you clarify what your right-of-way requirements are and clarify previous statements versus what's shown on your
Yeah, so
documents?
I can speak to Rocky Mountain Power's side of that. I believe at the last hearing, the question was asked, what would we normally get under a standard 138 kV line? Usually that's a 30-foot offset from center line. That's one standard. Further on in our standard, and this is Rocky Mountain Power standard, we would get that because it is a conservative calculation. If you go through and calculate actual right-of-way width needed based off of where those poles are specifically, you get some number less than 30. So the difference between 30 and 28.5 in this case is because of the actual location of the poles in this case as calculated. As far as the existing right-of-way goes, we took the current NESC standard, the requirements to safely operate and maintain a 46 kV line off of that center line, calculated out that width by NESC for today's standards, and that's where the 27 feet comes from.
Why wasn't that on your initial application?
I believe that it was Commissioner Payne who asked for detailed maps showing all of that lined out specifically.
Sorry.
I don't think that answered the question in terms of why was it represented in earlier discussions all along that the prescriptive easements were like 20 to 25 feet in total width?
I can't answer as to why that wasn't discussed at the last meeting. We have this information available to us today as requested.
Bill?
Yeah, Michael, I want to get back to that question about burying. Can you move this, where, is that Center Street?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
So this is one pole on the east side, and then the next pole is right here on the west side,
so,
at least for this short span.
right, and that's right at the county line.
That's correct. So
Yeah.
that, at least in this location, the east side of Highway 113 is county. When you go farther south, it actually becomes city, but right here is county.
Okay, so that's an arterial road, and if we wanted to mitigate the visual impact of having that pole right on that, right on the road and the line going over it, can we put that underground, that stretch, so the poles are back far enough that they're not really visually impactful?
So what you're proposing is this pole would be buried, this would be above ground, and then another pole over here in the county. would be
Something
above
like
ground.
that.
So just this stretch. And so that'd be something would need to be looked at regarding if that's possible on the power company's side,
Right.
and what the cost would be, and that would be our responsibility as a city to pay that cost for the difference.
But is that something that you've done in the past for little stretches? Relatively little, I'm not sure how long that is.
It is very rare for requesting entity for anyone, whether developer or city, county, to pay to bury a line. It's very expensive. The studies that were done specifically didn't contemplate terminal poles where it dead ends and goes down and goes a few hundred feet or a couple hundred feet, and then rise back up and continue on. There would be costs associated because those dead end structures have pretty high cost. It's one of the more high cost items associated with it, although the whole thing's pretty expensive. The other thing to consider aesthetically is you're going to have to bring that line into two dead end poles that I guess theoretically would be right next to the road before you go underground and then come back up on two more dead end poles to continue.
Why two and not one on either end?
Each circuit terminates onto its own dead end.
You have potheads and lighting arresters and cable coming out.
Okay, so it isn't feasible.
It is feasible. It's not.
Not practical.
Considering that that's the driver of the.
Got it.
So,
Okay,
so the
thank
aesthetics
you.
include 2 poles, and then you also have other wires you're saying that come down?
Yeah, 4 poles. You
Yeah.
have 2 poles on
2 poles on each side, yeah, each side.
And then you have the overhead lines coming into a dead-end structure, and then each circuit, which has 3 wires, comes down the poles, and then it's underground, and,
Quick question, so we can at least be comparing apples to apples. We continue to have presented before us existing pole heights that are total pole heights, not from the ground. In other words, it overstates it when you look at it, when you're comparing a 55-foot versus 75. So how much of the existing poles out there, how much of the height is actually underground?
For poles that are, poles come in 5-foot increments, typically. Poles that are 90 feet and less, the heuristic is 10% of the pole height plus 2 feet. So on a 65-foot pole, it's 8.5 feet, so you're 56.5.
Okay, so the tallest, roughly, it sounds like the tallest existing poles is 56, 57 feet.
There,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
And the new one under short span would be 60, 65, 70 range, depending on the location. One other thing to consider that wasn't necessarily touched on as you consider long span versus short span, I guess also in addition to underground, is the ability to decide where those poles are placed on a short and long span. If you look at these maps, just for example, on the short span, you can see where these poles are located, and the shorter the span, you have less ability to adjust them to property lines, for example. One thing that we were able to do, I think more effectively on the longer spans, was to place these new poles at the property lines predominantly, rather than in the middle, which you have to consider impacts on that and whether that's less or more.
So this is the map that kind of shows an example of that.
Yeah.
You might want to go through this one.
Yeah, so on the long span, these black dots that you can see, with a longer span, determining what the span length would be, we mapped it out to align with, as close as we could, within reason, property lines. So the subdivision that's to the south of us here, you're not looking directly out your back window and you see a pole. It's more adjacent on the property line. On the short span, because the span lengths are much shorter, we have less of an ability to play with that and try to optimize that from a site perspective.
And so what is the incremental difference in pole height between the short span and the long span?
If you want to pull that table, I think that illustrates that pretty well comparatively. So in each section, so here's Ward's Lane. You can see the top one's the short span. You can see 258 feet is the controlling span there, and we've got 330. We're sliding it around a little bit to hit those property lines as best as we can.
So 10 feet difference.
And pole height, yeah.
And that's total, that's the above ground height that we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's for the bulk of them. As you get towards the end, you see there's a 70, both the steel poles are 70, but for all the tangents, it's 10 feet.
I have a question that's going to start with Nicole and then segue away. We ask developers often, and developers often bring it to us, that they want to berm their common area so that when you're driving down the road, you're not looking right at somebody's house, you're looking at a nice berm full of landscaping. Berms, however, bring up the ground level. You told us last meeting that the key was that height between ground level and that bottommost line, that was sort of the key to the whole thing.
Right, that's a fixed distance and that cannot change.
Okay, so if we have required a developer to berm their property, are you going to then have to raise your pole heights the amount of the berm?
Potentially, depending on where the berm is in relation
Okay.
to the line.
Okay,
It's not necessarily if it's offset enough, then we have enough ground clearance. If it's too close to the line, then yes, they will have to be raised to maintain that National Electric Safety Code clearance of line to ground.
Okay. In your vegetation, bramble and burns, you talk about a wire zone. Is that area the area that the berm could not intrude into?
It's gonna depend upon the design of the berm and where it's at. Potentially, it could be placed in there, but we also have to consider what kind of, if there's any, the landscape that goes with it. So, within the wire zone, yeah, there might, I would say you wanna keep the edge of the berm to there and then create it, cause that keeps it out of, the wires and then any possible wind conditions that are gonna move those wires out. And so if you're gonna place a berm, I would say put it the edge of it on the edge of that wire zone, then create the border. Then there would be a better chance of not having to raise the line.
I wouldn't anticipate that being a problem. Most, I believe all of the poles are going within right of way. The berms are always outside of the right of way.
What is your span though on your what you're proposing here? The width of your, because your wires are out from the poles, right? What's that width?
So the right-of-way width that we have labeled takes into account that blowout condition, which is one of the National Electric Safety Code conditions that I have to check for. So that 28.5 feet for the short spans or 29 feet for the long spans takes into account that wind condition. So that is what we would need.
Okay, what I'm asking is how far from the center line of the pole are these wires out? Basically how big's that wire zone is what I'm asking.
So it all
From the
depends
center line.
on specific spans, structure design, things like that. That's something I'd have to go back to my calculations. I don't have those with me to figure out what that distance is right now.
Okay.
Do you know about order of magnitude?
About 8 feet out from the center line of the pole.
10 feet out from the wire zone.
8, 10 feet?
I'll have
That
to
seem
look at it.
reasonable?
That's not something I can
What-
give you right
whatever
now.
the AKB column estimated was about 8 feet long. On a daily pole.
Okay, and this is where I segue into the next part of this, which is,
That would affect the berm.
again, on your bramble and burns, which we've got up here,
want trails anyway.
you've got a border area where obviously you're saying, we want a height limitation because it's easier to grow things that don't grow into your lines than it is to grow things that are going to grow into your lines. Again, we have developers who come to us and say, this is what we want to put on our berms. How wide generally is that border area?
Yeah, so that is exactly what's calculated in the right-of-way width calculation. So the extent of, as Nicole was mentioning, you have the blowout of the wire, the physical conductors sitting, directly below, or the wind's blowing slightly, laterally, I guess, from the center. And then you have the distance that NESC makes you go to safely maintain that line. That's the edge of the border zone. That's
So-
why the easement's calculated with what the easement is.
So your easement goes from this point to this point?
Yeah, and this map that you're referring to shows a transmission line of a much higher voltage than what we're talking about.
I know it does, but I'm just trying to get a
Correct,
sense.
Yeah, border to
Okay,
border.
okay. As somebody who has been known to enjoy the outside, I've ridden horses along power lines because they're great. You guys kill everything. How compatible is this Bramble and Burns right-of-way method with landscaping a berm at the edge of a development?
I think it depends on the design. I mean, we specifically go out and get a width that we need to safely operate and maintain that line. That's based off of the border zone. It doesn't preclude anything potentially from being planted there. It's just, it stops the height of that, right? We have to make sure it stays out of the line. I think it's on a case-by-case basis for me to give some general statement and say, yeah, you always can or you always can't. I don't think that's an appropriate answer.
Okay. Michael, I'm going to swing over to you on this one. We have developments that have been approved that are going to be, you know, their border, their berm and everything else, their landscaping is going to be in the easement area. Who are we asking to accommodate whom here? Do we ask as a condition that Heber Light and Power and Rocky Mountain Power have to work with the developers and the city on a revised landscape plan? How do we deal with this?
So our ordinance has a landscape plan that's required. Now, there's not any type of requirement for berming. And so if there is gonna be berming with any planned unit development or any other development that has common area, it's gonna be on the developer's accord that they wanna put that berm in. And so that would end up being a negotiation, I think, between the developer and the power company on that. Now, if we ever revise our code, we do have required berming that's included in the code, then I think the city would end up being part of that negotiation. But as of right now, we just have required landscaped area that includes irrigation lines and grass. And so whenever we get a landscape plan, the trees and berms are always something that's included on the developer's accord.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have any new questions from the commission of issues that we haven't already addressed for Rocky Mountain Power?
I do,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. And these are going to be kind of general, but I think they're very important issues because, I mean, before us is a conditional use permit. And rightfully so, all of our discussion has been kind of focused on your proposal. Yet at the same time, under the premise of a conditional use permit, we're supposed to be looking at the detrimental impacts and how those can be mitigated. So let's just kind of talk about those in big picture here. From a health standpoint, do you feel that all health impacts are completely mitigated
Seriously.
in your proposal?
Yes, I do, and in fact, we included a study by the National Institute of Health and Environmental Studies specifically talking about transmission lines and its impact on public health. That's a matter of record. We stand by the expertise of those scientists and doctors that perform this study.
And I would question the order of that question because I don't think the public health issues that are controversial like that are within the purview of the Planning Commission. So,
Mr. Chairman, if I may, a conditional use permit is supposed to...
yes, but it is a controversial issue, and the information we have before us, I think, addresses that in the packet. So I don't think it's something we need to bring up. I consider it argumentative.
Well, I would just, let the record state that I understand it's controversial in the standpoint that we have studies that say there aren't an impact as well as studies that do say there is an impact.
Can I address that just
Sure.
really quick? 'Cause we talked about this. So there probably are studies out there that probably say that there are negative impacts, but they're not in front of us. They've never been submitted. And so what you as a commission can consider tonight is the information that you have before you, and you have no information or no evidence before you that would raise question about what it is that they've submitted. So even though you might have heard of things out there, there might be other things out there. It's not here. You don't have it in front of you. And so really you don't have any basis to question right now the findings that they have submitted. There's nothing in the record that would allow you to do so. So that's really more, you're limited by what it is that you have before you.
Corbin, is it also that we cannot consider health impacts under federal law?
I haven't heard that. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. It's more that you've got you have to comply with them. You have to consider what you've been given, okay?
Any additional questions?
Do visual aesthetic impacts fall under the purview?
Well, I mean, I guess you can ask your question on that. I think they've spent their time, I mean, I don't know what your question is on that. What would your question be on that?
Well, my question to you is that something that we as a planning commission can discuss?
Oh,
The visual
certainly.
impacts.
I mean, the visual impacts, yeah, I mean, but I think that's kind of what they've just addressed for the last hour and a half.
Okay, and I guess my question on the visual impacts, do you feel that your proposal completely mitigates all visual and aesthetic impacts?
Yeah, from an impact perspective, your baseline conditions of the existing transmission line, I believe we counted 25 existing poles. Both proposals before you reduced the pole count. We've placed distribution facilities underground. Hebo and Power generously offered to do that, as well as coordinate the communications coming off the pole. Yeah, I think that we've addressed it. I think that that's actually the question that the commission has to answer.
Yes.
And if I can.
Point well taken,
just
thank
one
you.
thing, once again, you're asking if they've completely mitigated. The standard is not to completely mitigate. They don't have to eliminate. They just have to reasonably address the issues. And so asking them, that goes beyond.
Okay. So you feel you've reasonably addressed the visual impact?
For all of the points I just made, we have fewer poles, distribution facilities underground, multiple, options trying to limit the impact based on color. I believe that we've given reasonable accommodation to reduce and remove the impact.
And economic impacts?
Specifically what you're referring to.
The potential to negatively affect adjacent or affected property values?
I believe from an easement perspective, we've shown what the excess cost calculation that we estimate is as requested. And as far as negotiating easements on a case-by-case basis, if there is any additional easements, that's going to be performed.
Yeah, just to clarify, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't make it clear in my question. I wasn't referring to value of easements, et cetera, but the negative economic impact that, larger increased in power lines can have upon adjacent property owners.
I don't know of any information in the record that demonstrates that there are these impacts that you're referring to.
Did you provide any studies to planning staff in that regards?
And all the information that we have on easement calculations, et cetera, is included in our application as part of the record.
Commissioner Payne, I'm going to determine that you're being argumentative again, and therefore your questions are out of order. I'll ask the audience to also maintain order. Thank you.
If you want to ask the questions and will allow the questions to be asked, we have a right to speak up.
No, you do not.
There's a public hearing.
Commissioner, can I ask one other question?
It is not a public hearing, it's a public meeting, and when the time is appropriate, I will, if we have time and we're ready to get to it, I will provide for opportunity to provide additional comments of things that we haven't had before us, but this is not a public hearing, and therefore it's pretty much up to the chairman to decide.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So one thing we talked about was the width of the road on 970 specifically, and moving those poles out there to be outside of that right of way. Would you be able to provide the information by the time of if this were to be approved, would you be able to provide the impact difference between what you're proposing here and what would be required with the right of way?
To clarify,
Is that what I'm saying?
if you were to provide us specific engineering drawings of what is planned through that section, could we update our drawings accordingly?
Yeah, to let so when it's viewed by the city council, they would know what the impacts are.
Assuming the recommendation is made today, when will this be heard by city council?
So it would be our next month's city council meeting, the first meeting of September. It's going to be September 10th.
I believe we can have that prepared by that meeting.
I'm sorry, it'd be the first Tuesday of September, so September 3rd.
The answer's the same.
Nicole, one really quick question. You talked about one of the finishes for the poles was sort of a dulled steel finish. What is the name of that?
It's called a dull galvanizing.
So kind of what it sounds like. Okay.
Yep, exactly what it sounds like.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
am not somebody who speaks engineering, and I appreciate the information.
Okay, do we have any additional questions for the Rocky Mountain Power folks? Questions for the Rocky Mountain Power folks? Questions for the folks? Thank you very much. Yes, Mayor.
I just wanted to take an opportunity to remind those who are here and who are a little bit frustrated about what is being allowed in this particular meeting, that we're being very careful about the legal ramifications of how we approach some of this. And secondly, that this is far from the last time this will be available for public hearing. So when this comes onto the city council agenda, there will be again another public hearing, and many of these questions will be addressed at that time. So the purpose before this commission tonight is a little bit different than what will be the purpose when it comes to city council. So while there is still frustration, and we're fully aware of that, I just want to make it very clear that we are far from finished, and that this particular meeting has a very specific purpose. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Mayor.
So just discussing with Mayor Johnson, it's most likely we'd be looking, if there is a recommendation tonight from the Planning Commission, the item's not continued, probably September 17th, but we'd go through the noticing process required by law, and we'd be happy to, so that'll be made public, and we'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any concerns with the next date would be, but we are required to notice that for 2 weeks before the meeting.
One more question, Michael, of sort of how long it takes staff to generate information. One of the options is burial, and that sounded incredibly morbid, for which I apologize. We know it's expensive. We've got numbers in front of us that the applicant has provided us with that say this is what the cost is. Is it possible for staff to provide us with a breakdown that would show things like, if we did say I'm having a special assessment district,
Yeah.
thank you. How much that would be, how large the district would be, how much money would be reasonable that could be generated by that. I would ask the same question vis-a-vis a bond, which I think would be less likely, quite frankly. Because the thing that I have struggled with is, I understand quite clearly Corbin's comments about we are limited to the information in front of us. This has been an incredibly important decision. I gave up a good half, and apparently the good weather half, of my vacation to come back here for this. You may all say I'm crazy. I won't disagree. But I've been on the Planning Commission long enough that, you know, I've read books provided by staff that say, this is how you promote your town. We're an outdoor recreation tourism town. Running something like a above ground power line across a really beautiful view corridor seems inconsistent with that. I'm also up here trying really hard to look out for the best interests of Midway City and the residents of Midway. And golfing them with a huge bill isn't exactly fair. And so I really feel that in order to make a decision, that's the best decision that I can make. If I had numbers in front of me provided by staff that said, if you want to bury it, this is what it really and truly is going to cost the people of Midway, that would be enormously helpful.
Didn't we have that in the first packet? I remember some numbers.
Yeah, there's
Not-
some numbers for
Yeah, we already had that.
burying the line.
But that's
in the
cost.
city limits, which would be the 9/10 of a mile roughly.
Yeah.
So,
But that's the
Commissioner
cost
Streeter-
of burial.
That's the cost of
Yeah.
burial, so I think Commissioner Street is referring to how do you finance doing that? So there's a number of different options, and this may not be a comprehensive list, but the option you mentioned was kind of a special assessment that would be a geographic area that encompasses properties, along the line, and that'd have to be decided how far out you would go on both sides of the line. That's a variable that we don't know. But if we did determine how far out to go, then you would go through and take a look at how many properties there are, what the assessed value of those properties are, what the term of the payment would be, and then it would have to be put to a vote for those within that special assessment area. And the county's done a number of special assessment areas. There was one attempted up at Brighton Estates, for instance, to redo their roads. There's a subdivision over on the south side of the county towards Daniels Canyon where they paved their roads based off a special assessment. So basically the voters within that area would have to approve that special assessment, and then for X number of years, 20 years or so, they would pay the cost on their property tax to cover that cost that was paid for by the city. So that's the special assessment option. There's always an option that everybody within the city pays, and so that's something would need to could be considered. The general fund is another option, and all of those things could be looked at. But the special assessment, we'd have to determine what the impact of that area would be and who would end up paying for that for how long, and then it would be put to a vote. You mentioned a bond also. That'd be bond
That's
for-
kind of down on my priority list. I
Yeah.
understand the complexities of that.
Yeah, there's different types of bonds, and we'd probably have our financial officer, Brad Wilson, to speak on that. But there are certain bonds that don't go to a vote. For instance, when we expanded the cemetery, we used a bond for that. That wasn't a general election vote. But obviously the open space bond was. So we'd have to find out which category this one falls into. But usually a bond does require a vote in most cases.
Can you remind us what that dollar amount was? The difference?
So roughly roughly the bury was 4 million, and to go above ground was $1 million, so the difference in cost is $3 million. So that's the rough number of what we're looking at.
Which segment was that in that chart? Which segment is in Midway? There was, I think, 9 segments that they had.
Yeah, that's a good question, and Jason has that information. Segment 8, according to this.
Segment 8.
Yeah.
Does that have the costs?
So
I thought it was more than 3 million.
Yeah, according to this chart, they're showing a separate trench for the 138 and 46 kV is 6 million, and then as for above ground, it'd be 1 million. So there's a 5 million.
That's what I remembered.
I've
Yeah.
heard different numbers, but this is the one here.
I was looking at it this morning, I thought it was 5 million. based on the
Yeah.
segment.
Yeah, I thought it was 3 million based on the initial application.
No, I remember 5.
So,
But how many property owners are there in Midway?
well, before we get down this rabbit hole,
I have to look that one up. I can tell you how many permanent residents we have, but I can't say exactly how many parcels there are.
yeah,
Okay.
before we get down a rabbit hole on this, my question was, could staff provide that information and how long would it take?
So, we'd have to work with our financial officer on that, but we'd have to determine the parameters to be able to calculate that. That would be the key.
Okay.
So the term, and then also distance, those two things, length of pavement and then also impact to properties.
One thing that I will say, simply by word caution, once again, under our statute, they're required to provide to us the information of how much it would cost, the difference between the two, which they have done. I don't know that we've got the legal basis to say we can hold up moving forward. The problem of the city and how they're gonna pay for that difference is not part of the application process. If that is something that you do want to see, and I think it's very reasonable, you could certainly put that in one of the conditions or one of the recommendations to the city council and say, we would like to have you go and do this analysis to determine what it is that it's actually going to cost everyone. But I don't know that you've got a legal basis tonight to say, yes, we're going to hold this up. That's not part of the application process.
But what was part of the application process was we asked for more accurate numbers, especially regarding the burial costs at the June meeting. And although this is a very informative supplement that they have given us as far as sort of all the different options, there's not any clarification of this is what the burial cost is actually going to be. And
I don't know that I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
They provided that.
They provide that in the
Last
first
Yeah.
meeting.
And that wasn't one of the conditions.
Yeah.
they did provide it. Our issue was that we said that it was not particularly accurate, which made making our decision very difficult because we had, and I'm sorry, I'm flipping through to my application to try and find where it
So
was.
Commissioner Streeter, I think what we mainly questioned was the cost of the difference in easements. And they provided the information on that.
They did provide the information on that, and that was very useful, but there was, and again, I'm going to apologize because I'm trying to flip through while I'm talking, and sometimes I don't do that very well. But there were cost calculations for the burial that there were issues with the accuracy of the cost calculations, that they were so broad as to be very difficult to actually figure out what the cost, like an accurate cost was.
Our motion, as given it reflected in the staff report, says that we continue the application for the transmission line rebuild as per our ordinance, accept staff reports, the condition, provide alternative route study, Rocky Mountain Power and Heber Light and Power to provide cost and size of easements, easement locations clearly marked above and below ground with the virtual aspects, more clarification, the number of poles, heights, and property line. Our motion, as it's reflected here, doesn't say anything about the underground. Okay.
Sorry, I'm trying to find then what if we're looking at
So, Mr. Chairman,
3 million as
Yes.
I thought was
I have a
5.
couple items of conversation I'd like to have with the planning commission here, just of the alternatives proposed. Are we okay if I move on to some of these? One is, I'd like to get kind of people's take here on the planning commission members between the two spans, and I'll kind of state my position on some of these. I think the long span, in my opinion, is a little better because it reduces the number of poles. The only questionable area I wonder about in there is the area of the name of the road escapes me again. The top part, the far west part, the Wards Lane. Just because that's a bigger height difference. It's a 10-foot height difference. I do like the placement still of the long span though. When you look at adjacent properties and stuff like that, and the homes that are there. So I'd still probably lean towards that. So I'll kind of state my opinion, but curious to hear others. And then also on the color of poles and the type of finish we have on the poles, I quite strongly prefer the rust colored ones, in my opinion. But those are two items I think is something to consider. I'm interested in hearing other people's opinions about those as well.
I'm probably a minority here, but, or maybe Natalie feels similar on one regards. I would prefer to see burial as the first option. The second option for me from a perspective is kind of going back to the actual language of in state code here for conditional use permits. It also says if the reasonably anticipated detrimental effects of a proposed conditional use cannot be substantially mitigated by the proposal or the imposition of reasonable conditions to achieve compliance with applicable standards, the conditional use may be denied. That would be my second option after burial.
Okay, I can, as far as the burial aspect, I'll state my opinion on that, I guess, as well. I think there's $5 million could go a long ways to improving the city in a lot of ways that'll impact, I think, more people than changing an existing line that's already there and, changing the heights slightly and then adding an additional line on the same poles. I would rather see that much money spent on other things within the city. If you were to say, if we're going to spend that much money, I'd rather see that go in other places. But that's just my take on that one. That's why I didn't address that in my questions. But curious to hear other people's comments on the other.
I agree with you on the long span. I think that is going to mitigate having problems between the different subdivisions and houses, and I like the rust color. I think I have to agree with you on that.
Yeah.
So I went and drove the whole route today and kind of looked at it. And I think the proposal will probably look better than what's there now when they get rid of the distribution and communication lines.
I agree.
And the number of poles. I think it's at least as good, if not better, than what we've got there today. So I'd go with the longer spans. And I'd be strongly opposed to burying because of the cost. Strongly opposed. I think that would be fiscally irresponsible, given the minimal impact that this will have, in my view. And as far as the color, I don't like the rust color when I drive down Highway 40. I'm not sure I don't like galvanized. I would want to look at the dull galvanized, but I really don't like that rust color on 40.
It's like an older galvanized pole. It's really odd.
Yeah. I'm sort of there also, although I really don't like the idea of seeing those poles on Stringtown Road. That's the one area, because the others to me are secondary roads. So that's the only one I'd be concerned about. But and depending upon how many property owners we have, who knows? $500 each? I have no idea. In general, though, yeah, I prefer the tall poles. And other than my desire to have Stringtown buried, I would go with, above ground, because it is a lot of money and we have a lot of other uses for that money. As far as color, I'd need to see that dull. Yeah. I mean, the brown it's as good as you can get, I guess, but I'd like to see the dulled galvanized.
If we go above ground, I think the long spans are less visually impactful. I like the fact that it allows a little bit of wiggle room, because otherwise we have an issue where you pull out of Eldon's Landing and you have a pole right there. And I base that might sound a little obsessive. I base that on the fact that I have a pole in my driveway, I have a ditch, and I drive a truck with long trailers. And I don't want to be very proud of saying I was not the one who hit the pole. But it's an issue, and if it makes it easier to adjust things that we go with the long span, I think that's the better option. Dull galvanized, I passionately hate the rust color. And as far as the burial, the reason that I was asking about if staff could get us the numbers, I look at it from the point of view of, we're an outdoor recreation town. And, Commissioner Ream says, hey, Stringtown Road, because it's going to be a major road. I look at 970 South because a lot of people going up and down 113 are going to be looking at that. But that's why I really feel like if we're going to say one way or the other, buried or above ground, first of all, we need to know the difference. My understanding was it was actually 3 million, not 5 million. And then we need to understand what we're asking people to pay if we go that direction. And I have to admit, I've been looking at this from like zeroed into, if you sit in a car on Center Street, what are you looking at, all the way out to sort of what we used to call the 30-foot level, 30,000-foot level. And, Corbin, you remember this lovely thing when you had to do the bar application and you had to list all the lawsuits you've ever been party to. Mine was quite long because I've been in business for a long time. I look at this and part of me just cringes because I know that Rocky Mountain Power wants a solution. I've tried to talk to a lot of people along the affected areas. More than a few have said they want a solution. They just want something done. And in the process of talking to people, I know there are a lot of people who are very passionate about this, very passionate against this. And I just, at that 30,000-foot level, I go, we're bound by what's in front of us. We consider what's in front of us, the four corners of the evidence that's here. But the practical part of me says, everybody, all the parties involved in this really should pursue the informal track where you work towards trying to find a solution and trying to settle whatever needs to be done, because it's not good for the people of Midway, no matter which direction things go. I mean, I sit here and go, lawsuits make my classmates really happy. It makes them a lot of money. Does not do good things for the people of Midway. And I just think if we could get the numbers and seriously consider burying it, it's the better, in the long term, the better solution. But I don't want to say I want to bury it without seeing those numbers.
Does that cover everybody?
It's everybody.
Okay. Before I ask for the motion, I know there are a lot of people here that have strong feelings one way or the other on the issue before us. And while this isn't a public meeting and we're not required to ask for public input, before we make a motion, and the commission, and you can see that the commissioners are giving a lot of thought to this. There's a diversity of thought among the members of the Planning Commission, and it'll be interesting to see, what motion comes out of the group tonight to go forward, and secondly, where the vote falls. I suspect we're not going to have a unanimous vote one way or the other on this item here before us. But before we do that, if there's anyone from the public that has something new to offer that hasn't been addressed either in the June meeting or we haven't kicked around here at one level or another tonight, I would like to go ahead and open up 15 minutes for someone to come forward. We would like to get out of here before the 10 o'clock news tonight, and we still have some other items on our agenda that we have to go through. And I point out there are some people involved in those other items have sat here mostly patiently while we've been going down this tortuous road on this item before us. So if there is anyone that has something new to offer and would like to make a comment, please feel free to come forward, state your name and address. Please try to be brief and try to give something that's new and will give us information to help our decision. So.
My name is Ted Caldwell. I live on Ward Lane. Just one question that I haven't heard an answer to, and that is, it's my understanding when you change voltage, sizes, and those kind of things, it interrupts the prescriptive easement. I've not heard an answer to that. Does that change, does it eliminate the prescriptive easement when those kind of things take place? And if so, those things can be considered into the costs. Thank you.
Thank you. Corbin, do you have an answer to that?
It doesn't.
It doesn't. Okay. Our legal person tells us that it doesn't. Okay. Any other questions or comments from the public?
My name's Morgan Lynch. I live on Stringtown. But the question I had is for years I've been told 970 is not going through, and it is going through. We all, based on the discussion here tonight, 970 is going through all the way to Stringtown. Is that a foregone conclusion?
Yes.
So it is on our master road plan. The 970 would connect all the way from 250 West to Stringtown Road. So it's on our plan. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. A lot of it depends on if those properties develop. If it is on our master transportation plan, though, the city does have the option to go through a process of forcing the road to be built, but we'd have to determine, there'd have to be three things that would need to be met. One is that it's on our road plan, which it is. Another one is that we have the money to build the road. Another one is that there's a need for the road. So those things would have to be met in order for the city to build the road. But I think it's really more of a process of if the properties develop, that would probably determine if that road goes through or not.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Clark Bruder. I'm president of the Homeowners Association in Cascades, Soldier Hollow. I'm currently building right by where the corner post is supposed to go towards the substation. I would very much encourage what Commissioner Streeter said. As a homeowner, I would like the ability to see what the special assessment is and at least have some input. We feel somewhat powerless sometimes in these meetings and somewhat powerless in this process. That would give us some way of assessing, you know, is it worth it to us to pay the assessment versus and get the burial. That to me is much more proactive and much more involving of us than just, you know, saying it's going to be above ground and that's it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tatum Buell, and I'm on 880 Stringtown Road. My tree is the one that will be chopped down. I have 3 kids that are sitting outside in the dark right now because my husband is at MD Anderson and has stage 4 cancer. So when you said earlier, this is a controversial topic, let's not dive into that. I implore you, for the many concerns that I have for this project and trying to keep an open mind to the need of Midway and the residents, I implore you to be controversial, to dive into that topic. You don't take help for what it is until you don't have it anymore. There's a lot of children that live along this route. The World Health Organization has firm, clear, published ideas on health repercussions when it comes to high voltage wire. I'll repeat, the World Health Organization. My husband has a note from his doctor at MD Anderson, who's a cancer research, worked at Cambridge University studying cancer, and has a direct correlation between high voltage power lines. So I implore you, be controversial, dive in, get the proper information, because this is residents currently, and this is future generations. So this project isn't just a glimpse in time, it's people's health, children's health. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Mary Brown and I live in Turnberry, and I have no
direct impact with these power lines in terms of my property values or anything else. But as a citizen of Midway, who loves this valley, this is not new, you've heard this before, but I would also like to see not only a canvassing of people who have property adjacent to these lines. I would be willing to pay for these lines to be buried, even though I live far from them. I think it impacts our entire community. The question I would like to see answered is when you're considering the cost of burying the lines, can we not consider also the easement differences? Because maybe we have, but when I've listened to it, it seemed like we've been considering the cost of burying in terms of the trenches that need to be dug and all that kind of stuff, but also the cost of purchasing these easements, and it seemed to be a lot less property we have to consider if we did bury them. Also, there seems to be some discrepancy, Corbin, about whether that change in voltage, et cetera, would impact these easements. Could you provide precedence or back up what you're saying in terms of giving us the clarification of that statement?
Certainly, we had that on a meeting, absolutely, and it's on the public record, and I can get it to you. It's been probably a year ago that we went through all the legal analysis on this, so I'm more than happy to provide that to you.
That would be helpful, especially if there's any updates to it or the things that have been heard since then in different courts. Thank you.
Is there anyone else?
Chris Bernard, and I live on 570 South. There's been a lot of talk about the difference between the cost of burying the line and placing the line above ground. Can't we ask whoever's building the line, Eagle Latin Power or Rocky Mountain Power, to actually put it out to bid as above ground and below ground as an alternate bid? And then instead of all this conversation, oh, it's $4 million, oh, it's $6 million, oh, it's $3 million, we know it's exactly $7.82 million, and we know what we're talking about. Because so far, it's all just talk. And I'm sure, have you already put it out to bid? That's a good question. No. And do you do your own bid documents? And if you do, write a set of bid documents as an alternate. I bid projects all the time. There's an alternate. 9 times out of 10, they don't do it because they don't have the money. But ask whoever is building the thing to get a bid so we know exactly how much it's going to cost. And then you guys and the city and the mayor can make a decision. Because right now, you don't know. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Scott Lewis, 541 North Meriwether Way. I just for a point of clarification, I just would like to understand the list of mitigations that were required, best efforts. Those were help. What was the list, Michael?
Yeah, so in the conditional use permit language, there's a number of items that need to be considered. And so let me take a look at that. So there's 7 different things that are listed in the analysis. And some of these don't necessarily apply, but I'll go through them real quick. So the proposed use is conditionally permitted within the land use title and would not impair the integrity and character of the intended purpose of the subject zoning district and complies with all applicable provisions of the code. So that's looking at this as more of an administrative type look if they're meeting the rules.
You listed out earlier that there were some efforts towards mitigation that they were required to make best efforts towards.
Mm-hmm.
Is that this list?
So this list does cover quite a bit of ground. So what was identified?
Was one of those property value, lost property value?
So there was a study submitted as part of their application regarding property values. So that's one of the studies that is on the website. As for the direct language in the code, yeah, number 5 gets close to that, but it doesn't actually say that. It talks about health, safety, convenience, and welfare to the city, but it doesn't actually say property values.
Okay.
So that's probably the closest one I can think of on the list of conditional uses. That's what's listed in state code.
I just was trying to understand how, the conversation we tried to have earlier about, mitigation of property, impact on property values was argumentative. I don't understand how that's argumentative. It seems like a reasonable, discussion to ask what's being happened, because from what I can see, there's a cost in putting above-ground power lines or putting below-ground power lines, and it's millions of dollars. It's just a matter of who's paying for it. It's either being paid by Rocky Mountain Power and Warren Buffett, or it's being paid by the local property owners in lost property value. So you're shifting the cost one way or the other. The costs are still there. You know, there's still a cost in putting, a greater cost in putting above-ground power lines than what pencils out. You're just shifting that cost to local Midway residents and away from the entity that wants to put those power lines in place. So just apples to apples comparison. I just wanted to make sure that was clear, and that should be a conversation that's had, because that's a real impact. There was a gentleman here at a city council meeting one of the earlier times we discussed this, and they had their property for sale, and they were getting down to closing, and then they couldn't close their house because the buyer found out the power lines were coming through. I mean, that's a real impact in real lives and real dollars that aren't being penciled into the total cost. So, thank you.
Thank you. And just to clarify the record, my comment about argumentative was I wanted to avoid members of the commission arguing with the proponent and having a debate. Not necessarily that we shouldn't consider issues that may have more than one side to them. It's just not in the decorum of this meeting for us to argue either with the public or with the proponent or staff. Thank you. You have 2 minutes.
Quick question. Andrew Nagger, just off Ward Lane. You said 30 days to pay back if we were to bury. Is there any leniency there? Why is it 30 days? Can you
Per
explain a little
ordinance?
bit more around that?
Just, it's state statute. And so they really make it very difficult. This is not something that the city has power over. It says that they can require full payment within 30 days, which makes it very difficult, right? I mean, how do you bond for it? How do you do any of the suggestions? But it's not something that we have power over, that agency there. Yeah.
Corbin, just if I can, just to clarify so I can understand that a little better. 30 days payment, and yet the cost haven't been incurred. Is it 30 days have to raise the funds? In other words, how do you pay without the cost incurred?
I believe the statute says it's within 30 days of the start of the project.
But how do you pay when the work hasn't been completed? Obviously, the city wouldn't be paying Rocky Mountain Heber Light or paying subcontractors. I'm just...
I mean, it would be an interesting process, but at the end of the day, I think what the state legislature was trying to do is say, if you're going to require them to go beyond what they would normally have to do, you're going to have your cash in hand ready.
Right.
I mean, and so that's really what it boils
So,
down to.
so maybe more accurately, it has to be raised or
Yeah, I mean, it may not be
quantified
until it's done, but it's like you've got to demonstrate it's there, and so we're not going to make you go and do this and then come back and say, whoops, we don't have the money.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay, we thank members of the public for your interest in your comments. Now we're at the point where we earn our high paychecks. There you go. Would any member of the commission like to propose a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Sure.
I make a motion that we recommend approval for the Rocky Mountain Power and Heber Light Power requesting a conditional use permit to build the existing, rebuild the existing Heber Light and Power transmission line to install the 138 kV line. And with that, I do so given the ordinances that are in place and the information that's presented before us, and also looking at the need to provide the infrastructure for residents throughout the valley and the benefit there. I recommend that we accept the possible findings from the staff report, and that we have the following conditions on there, and that is that the Heber Light and Power and Rocky Mountain Power work with the engineer to provide the following information before it goes to the city council, and that is shifting the poles so that they do not outside of the right of way on all of the roads, including the width of 930, the widening of 930.
970.
Or sorry, 970. And then also they work with address the impacts on the site triangles for that. Recommend the approval of the long span alternative in the rust colored. Recommend, and then additional condition that the staff provide information to the city council before they make the assessment, that basically look at the special assessment and what those costs and impacts would be if they did want to bury the lines.
So special assessment to the impacted property owners?
Yes. So that information could be provided to city council for them making their decision.
Do you want to include the type of pole and the finish on the pole?
He did rust.
The rust colored, but the proposal would be the wood and the steel as proposed.
Okay.
Is what I'm saying.
Could you leave the, just clarification, yeah, could you leave the color up to the city council with the stipulation that the, whatever the one is, the
Dull
the
galvanized.
Dull
dulled,
galvanized.
the dulled galvanized be, both samples be brought to city council?
I mean, everything we do is a recommendation to the city council anyways, so they can do whichever direction they want. If we
Okay.
wanted to do a separate vote, if that's that
Mm.
controversial on the color, then I'd be fine taking that out and then voting separate so they know what our opinions are, I guess. But
Okay.
it
I
seemed
would
like we had
actually
more people
suggest
on.
that. That
yeah.
seemed to be the thing that people were most split on,
Okay.
was
So we
color.
can we can remove the color on that and then just make a separate motion if that's. Does that work?
I have a
Yes.
proposed amendment to yours.
Okay.
To,
Just wait a minute before
We
we get
haven't-
too far down
yeah.
there. We haven't had a second on the motion
And,
yet.
and
so-
hang on, because before you make a second, do you want Rob to include that they work with developers on landscape plans, blah, 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 or do you want to leave that out?
I'd leave it out.
I'd leave it out.
No, they'd have to
No.
work with them anyways.
Yeah.
If they're
Yeah.
planting
I wouldn't
lines
put
under
that
their
in
easement, then
I'll
they'd have to do that.
I'll second Rob's motion.
Okay.
can I propose the amendment now?
Okay, let me see if I can capture it here then. We have a motion before us that we recommend to City Council approval of the conditional use permit to rebuild the existing Heber Light and Power transmission line and install a 138 kV line for Rocky Mountain Power. We're accepting the findings of the staff report. I won't repeat those. But I'm assuming you're accepting all of them with the conditions that Heber Light and Power and Rocky Mountain Power will work with the city engineer to ensure that the poles are located outside of the right-of-way or adjacent to on the edge of the right-of-way, and address the issues with the, what is it, site plan?
Site triangle.
Site triangle, yeah. Couldn't read my own writing. The second one is that we are recommending that we consider the long span option. And the third condition is that we have, prior to coming before City Council, that staff compile information on the cost to build, costs involved in going underground with the power line, and possible funding options.
Well, just a special assessment for the affected landowners.
What's
You want to
easy-
look at others, just that single one?
My proposed amendment was, if they're doing that, I think the council would like to know not only just what it would be for affected property owners only, but also do a second one that just shows for the city as a whole.
Which
Could
would be a
useful
bond.
information.
I wouldn't second.
Yeah.
So a broad, we're suggesting that whatever you do, Michael, for the city council would be to address the funding mechanisms, both with the local assessment and taking a broader view.
Okay.
So with that, as far as the motion that I presented in that, I would not accept that alternative as a requirement for that. Based on, I mean, the reason for doing so is because I would strongly, if the city was to put that much money forward to something, I think there's a lot better uses that could be done for that. So I wouldn't be interested in doing that because I don't think it's fiscally responsible. But I mean, if the residents there want to carry the burden of that, then someone mentioned that in the.
So
in
your
the comments.
motion is.
I would keep it as it is.
Keep
The
it as
special
is.
assessment.
Okay, so
Yes.
we're not taking the broad look, we're taking the narrow look of a special assessment on the affected parties. Okay.
And if the council wants to look at that, that's their purview.
Okay.
As far as the recommendation.
So that's the motion as seconded. Did I capture most of it?
Yep.
Okay. Of it?
Yep.
Okay. Of it?
Yep.
Is there any discussion on the motion?
Wes, I got a question for you. Site triangle, you know how far they go, everything else. If we say, as we've said here, that site triangle, does that deal with the issue of, when you're coming out of a road, the pole on the other side of the road?
That would address, I know what you're
Because you know what I mean, when you come out of Eldon's Landing, you got a pole right there, and that makes swinging wide really hard. But that's on the other side of the street.
You're looking at a site triangle and a turning radius of the vehicle, which we absolutely will work with on the clearance turning radius, just part of the design.
Do we have to put turning radius in our motion, though?
The site triangle addresses
Wes
that.
Wes is going to do it.
The site triangle addresses that.
Addresses that, yeah.
So,
Okay, I'm just making sure that our motion addresses it, given the language that we
the
have.
intersection has the site visibility triangle, so, your curb. your
That's
turn
the,
radius is gonna be
that's the
considered.
one on Whitewater Way.
Yeah,
but-
that's the example that.
Yeah.
Pull the pole away from the intersection and if it's 40 feet away from the property line where the property lines intersect, there's not going to be an issue.
And that covers the one across the street from
Across the
Eldon.
street is going to be on the edge of the right of way, so that would, you'd have to go off the road to hit it.
Okay, all right.
Right away.
I just wanted to make sure that the language covered that.
Okay, any other discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, we have one opposed. The motion carries. We thank everyone for your
Do we
your
know-
patience and your interest. If you're not going to stay for the rest of the meeting, I ask that you go completely outside the building so we can continue to move on and not do any discussions out there, so we're not disruptive of the meeting.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank
before
you
we
very
move
much.
on,
Yes.
we removed the color from the
Oh, that's
motion
right.
in order to do
That's
that,
the
and we're going to do a vote to give the recommendations to
Oh,
the council.
okay.
So can we do that now?
Yes. Have a second motion? Go for it.
Are we doing a
I guess
motion
it's
or a
just-
straw poll?
It's just a straw poll, I guess, but
Yeah.
see
What's the
who
choices?
prefers the
Russ.
aged galvanized, unless someone prefers the shiny. I don't. That's against the ordinance, anyways.
Yeah.
But the aged galvanized and the rust. So we just need to vote how many favor
Yeah.
rust and how many favor the
Yeah.
aged galvanized.
Okay, go for it.
Okay.
I'll go for the galvanized, not having seen it.
Galvanized?
Yeah. So.
All those for rust.
Until I see
32.
galvanized, I can't make an intelligent decision.
You won't like it.
I may be.
So we got
I gotta
3 to
see it.
2.
Samples to look at.
Right, well, that was my
Rust
thing.
blends
They
in
need,
a lot
they
better
need to
than
bring
the
samples.
galvanized.
Show us some samples. and
Well,
then we can
that
decide.
was a straw poll, and it says we're not sure we're going to have to
3
look
to
at
2 then,
that.
I
So,
guess.
moving right along.
Okay.
Thanks for waiting for so long.
Heather, did we just bore you to death out there? No.
She had a nice nap. Okay,
It is unbelievably boring doing that.
item number 3.
Been waiting.
Another non-controversial item. Berg Engineering, agent for Watts Enterprises, is requesting a master plan amendment of Raymond Farms, which includes 3 phases. Proposal is to replace the 3 phases with 8 phases. Number of units, location of open space, and roads do not change with this amendment. Only new phase lines are being proposed, except to an adjust to Unit 84 and its driveway. Property is located at 200 East, 600 North in the R115 zone. Michael?
All right, thank you, Chairman Fuller, members of the Planning Commission. So the city's received an application to amend the master plan of Raymond Farm Planned Unit Development. The planned unit development is on almost 51 acres. It's in the R115 zoning district. So there's 96 building pads that have been approved on the 3 phases. There's 1 lot as part of this development. So the 3 phases, the first phase, which has been recorded, has 1 lot and then 38 building pads. Then the second phase has 37 units. All of those are planned unit development pads also. And then phase 3 has 21 units and 21 pads. There's private roads in the HOA. We do have some sensitive lands that are shown on the plat that I'll go over. And we do have services in the area that are servicing the subdivision. So this is located north of Main Street, along 600 North in between River Road and Center Street. It's a closer view of the project. This photo was taken last fall, so they just started construction now. There's a number of homes being built on site right now in phase 1. So just amending a master plan. So Raymond Farms Master Plan Agreement, in section 5 of that agreement, there's a clause that allows for an amendment if both the city and the developer mutually consent to amending that agreement. So in other words, the city's under no obligation to change the approved master plan. It's a discretionary item on the city's part. Master plan approval, when we're looking at master plans, the master plan must demonstrate the approval of the plan in multiple phases can occur such that the project can still function autonomously if subsequent phases are not completed. So what that means is we look at, there's got to be sufficient property per phase, water rights, roads, which is traffic circulation, so that deals with 2 points of access and cul-de-sac length, sensitive lands protection, and then open space. So those are things we look at per phase. We make sure that the initial phases, each phase can function on its own. A lot of times we see a lot of the open space deeded to the homeowners association with the first phases, so they always meet the requirement of 50%. Water rights also, those need to be turned over per phase. We need to make sure there's enough water rights. And our plan, our code actually requires for a master plan now that all water rights are held in escrow. This actually predated that code, so we're getting the water rights per phase at this point in time. So that's something to consider also. We have calculations basically per phase. We'd have to break that down further with this proposal. For proposed amendments, what's being asked for is add limited common areas behind 37 of the units. And those limited common areas would be 12 feet deep. So right now, on the recorded plat, which we'll look at, there's a building pad. Limited common area is usually where a driveway is located. That means that even though that area is owned in common by everybody within the planned unit development, only that particular property owner can park their car in that area. So it's common area. It's got restrictions on who can use it. This would add some common area behind each of the building pads, which would allow for an area for a deck, for instance, or a fire pit or a hot tub, something along those lines, pergola, for instance. And so this is actually something I think gives the pad owner a little bit of flexibility on controlling the very back end of their building pad. And that's been an issue in some of our other planned unit developments when somebody wants to build a pergola, but they can't because it's outside their building pad and they don't actually own that area. So this gives them a little bit of flexibility. Number 2 is adjust the pad dimensions and driveway of unit 84. So the current dimensions are 55 by 60. The proposed dimensions are 55 by 70. So that increases the square footage of that pad by 550 square feet. Also, I'll show you a drawing of the driveway and how that would be adjusted. And then amend the 3 phases of the master plan into 8 phases. So we'll go over some plans for that. This is the approved site plan for Raymond Farms planned unit development. This is the approved phasing plan. So yellow is phase 1, which has been recorded and is under construction. Phase 2 is this orange area, which completes the loop in the center of the project. And then phase 3 are the 3 cul-de-sacs. And so that was approved by, that was what was proposed to the city and what was approved by the city. And again, to amend this phasing plan would require mutual agreement by the city and by the developer. So this is the proposed site plan that's been amended according to this application. So we'll zoom in on a couple of things, but one thing that's very difficult to see is there's some limited common area behind 37 of these building pads that are dull. These ones up here are phase 1, so that's been recorded. Nothing's being proposed for adjustment up in this area, just in these areas that don't have the numbers on them. And this is the proposed phasing plan. So remember the past phasing plan had the 3 phases we just looked at. So again, phase 1 is intact. And then there's 7 phases beyond that, so 8 in total. Phase 2 is this green, and so the developer would be required to build the infrastructure for this entire loop. But these areas over here would be recorded as separate plats, is what's being proposed. And then there's also this yellow area that would have been part of phase 3, also this teal one, which would have been part of phase 3, and then blue, which is part of phase 3. So basically phase 2's been divided into 4 phases, phase 3's been divided into 3. So a total of 8 overall. What we need to look at again is that list of items such as traffic circulation. Would we have any cul-de-sacs that are beyond the limit of the city code? That doesn't appear to be the case here. We have good traffic circulation if that road is completely built. As for water rights, again, water rights would need to be deeded to the city per phase, per plat being recorded. We would have to go in and make a new calculation per phase and make sure that that water is deeded per plat. As for open space, the applicant has provided an open space breakdown per phase. And again, the requirement is the overall, as you move through the different phases, at least 50% for the entire development. So that has been looked at and reviewed, and they would meet that requirement regarding open space dedication to the HOA. Looking specifically at Raymond Farms Pad 84, so this is the end of that cul-de-sac on the very east side of the project. 84 is on the very end of that. You can see that it's pretty much a square over here on this plan, but over here it's a bit elongated, and there's been that common area that's been added. Driveway also comes in on the northwest side, whereas here it would be on the northeast side. So a minor adjustment to the driveway doesn't appear to have any major consequences. Then again, the limited common areas, it's easier to see on here where the original plan just has the building path itself. Here there's the 12-foot limited common area that's been attached to the back of each unit. It gives a little bit of flexibility.
Michael, before you change slides, the slide on the left shows a trail quite clearly. Slide on the right, that trail kind of looks like it gets eaten by the driveway.
You know, that is a very good observation there. We do have a wetlands area, and there is a possibility of building a trail in a wetlands area. We need to meet Army Corps requirements. You can have a boardwalk. And, you know, that is something that I didn't consider when I was looking at this. Maybe Paul has a good answer for that.
Those are the area between the wetlands and the sidewalk. They will be close to each other, or between the wetlands and the driveway.
So there's actually 2 trails.
Yeah, there's
This trail won't be there anymore, and the trail that you just mentioned goes like this.
So the proposal is to remove this trail on the south side of these 4 units. Okay.
That was a private trail.
That was a private,
Yeah, that wasn't a required trail per the agreement. So this trail around the edge over here is a required public trail.
That one would stay.
And that one would stay, but if you're proposing the private trail would be
And the trail next to the ditch on the other side, that remains just behind these units, that's gone.
That's gone.
Okay.
Michael, on the perimeter, are the setbacks maintained from the existing plan, i.e. no?
Yeah, we do have the setback requirement of, is 30
Well-
feet when this one was,
The
Well-
corner of 84 is not any closer than what it was before.
That's my question, because the applicant, per our request, went less than, or excuse me, greater setbacks than what code requires on the perimeter, and those are being maintained.
The northeast corner of 84 has been maintained.
Okay.
That's the nearest.
Right.
Any other questions on this slide then? Are there any questions about the limited common area that would be added behind these two paths?
What's the size of it?
I'm shocked
So they're 12 feet.
originally.
They are, so they vary depending on how wide the pad is. And some of the, because of the wetland areas, some of those don't extend all the way across the back of the path. For instance, that one is one of those.
So some of them look like
Those would be shown on the plat as limited common area, that's correct.
some of them look like they touch or encroach on the common area, maybe that's.
So there's a 25 foot, so there's a 25 foot, so there's a buffer around wetlands unless there is an exception given to that. And that's actually based off of our city engineer's recommendation. And some of those were always very close to the wetlands.
This is the result.
It appears 84 is a bit closer now to the wetlands.
But just to be clear, we talked about that in the original, that we have a 25-foot buffer around the perimeter of the wetland, and we had said because of the give and take, setting the setback off 300 north, we had said we would allow that to go within the buffer. Now that 12-foot area, just so you're well aware.
Yep.
Mhm.
So the third item is looking at adding additional phases. So this is something that would be impactful on city staff. We've talked about this before regarding another code text amendment. This is actually looking at the same issue on a different angle. So one is it does require more staff time when we look at more plats per development. So again, we're going from 3 to 8. So increasing from 3 to 8 phases, just to kind of give you an idea of what impact that has is, according to our code, each phase has to have preliminary and final approval, which is at least 4 meetings. So we go from 12 meetings to 32 by breaking this down into this many phases. So that's kind of, it impacts staff, it also impacts the planning commission, city council, on how many times you look at different projects and its phasing.
Is staff somewhat compensated by application fees for each phase?
That is correct. So we would receive an application fee per application. I guess you could say just on the scale size, if it comes in as one application, right now it's the same fee as if it's 3 phases or 1 phase. And so we are compensated with the application fee, but there is more work the more plats there are still based off of how much money comes in. So the actual dollar amount doesn't change with this. With the application fees.
So the application fees that are already paid cover the additional phases that are being?
So for instance, with the way our fees are set up right now, for preliminary approval per pad is $300, and then final approval is $100. So you're looking at $400 per unit. If you have 3 phases, it's a dollar amount, and if you have 8 phases, it's the same dollar amount.
Right.
And so that's what happens.
But our code currently would have allowed them to come in with this 8-phase plan initially,
Yeah,
right?
we proposed an 8-phase plan initially, that is correct. And really the only way to avoid that is if we put a minimum number of units per phase in our code.
Right.
And so that would be the way to limit how many
Phases.
phases they can have per how many units are in the development. So we would need to go in and say, well, for instance, 5 units is our limit per phase, or 10 units is our limit per phase.
And would that somewhat help alleviate the additional staff time by?
I think it could, in the fact that if you have, I'll just give an example, a 20-unit development, potentially could have 20 plats right now, which is an extreme example. But if you said our minimum is 7, then you'd end up with
2.
2. If it were 6, then you could have 3. So that would at least determine the minimum amount per phase. But that would be a code text amendment that we need to take a look at if we want to establish that minimum amount. Again, this is a discretionary item on the fact that the city council would need to agree that, to change this master plan. So there is definitely discretion here. The potential number of water board meetings, for instance, will most likely increase unless it's really planned out from the very beginning, and when they take the master plan to the water board, we have every phase calculated out. We can do that in one meeting if we have enough information. So I say potentially the water board meetings could increase, it depends on the planning. There's also other boards that take a look at it that are separate from the city but work with us, like the sanitation district. That's another board that reviews all of these different plans, and if they look at them per phase, then that's one meeting for them. So. Some of the proposed findings, the proposed master plan appears to meet the requirements of the code. So just looking at our master plan requirements for traffic circulation, we need to break down the water per phase. Open space appears to meet the requirements. So it looks like, at least from a code perspective, this does meet code. The number of phases will increase from 3 to 8, so that would be a fact of finding. Amending the master plan is discretionary, and the city is under no obligation to approve the proposal even if it complies with the land use code. And I don't have any proposed conditions for this, but I'd be happy to take any questions that the commission has.
My first question is probably directed both to you, Michael, and Corbin, and that is, because this is discretionary, does that give the commission and ultimately the council the complete discretion to, for example, add additional conditions, like to compensate the additional staff time? Or is that get outside the purview of what you can do when you amend a?
That's a good question. I mean, we've already got an existing one here. I mean, you certainly can, you have no obligation to approve it, right? So you have vast discretion to say, yeah, we'll approve it based on the following conditions, and you probably can put those in there. As long as they're not probably so far above and beyond anything, yeah, they probably are.
Something,
So I would see that if they didn't agree to whatever condition we have, they wouldn't have to amend the agreement, it would be left with the original agreement.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Michael, you have, there are basically 3 actions in front of us. One is the limited common area on a certain number of units, another one is Lot 84, and then there's the redrawing the phase lines. In a motion, can we address each of those separately, or they come as a package?
I think a motion could be made, and maybe the motion is, just for example, you like one of the 3 items, and so you would propose that item be changed with the master plan, or maybe it's 2 of the 3, or maybe 3 of the 3. So I think the motion could be tailored based off of the motion maker to what they would like to see happen.
Thank you.
Could you put up the 3 items on the slide, please? Anybody game for discussion, or we want a motion?
I got some questions still.
I have some questions.
So
Speak fast, my dog needs to pee.
the common area one for the limited common
Too
area.
late.
That's the pot calling the kettle black.
Recused yourself.
The limited common area question, how would that impact the open area ratios for the development if that was not considered open area?
And so, a common area, the way we calculate open space is based off of where you have your property lines.
Yes.
So limited common area wouldn't actually have an impact on that.
If you were to call it their yard, because you're essentially creating yards for each one of these people,
Yeah.
where they can do what they want to do. If those were considered yards, how would that impact the overall?
Would you pull up the open space map?
Yeah, so if there was something in the code that said you measured off of limited common area, then that would affect that open space.
Michael, will you show the open space map?
This one here.
So, I think the answer that you're looking for is, are the limited common spaces counted? If you look at this map, they're not. I'll borrow someone's pointer, maybe I'll.
Here's one right here.
Here's one right
So
here.
you have the same
Amount of
12-foot things for each lot anyways?
Are these ones not
He has it
orange right
shot
here?
in his.
So see how our colored
Space.
space doesn't go into the 12-foot blocks?
And that's the case right here too?
Well, yeah, look,
It's not
there's
green.
12-foot blocks, 12-foot blocks, 12-foot blocks.
I'm not seeing
So
your
what's-
pointer.
what's the-
Other side of the street, Paul.
What's the purpose
Here.
of what you're doing then?
Right, these
We
right
want to
here.
give people a private area behind so they could have a deck or a.
But isn't this doing it since it's not in your open space calculation anyways?
We are doing it, and we're not counting that as open space. So these places where we've added it, it doesn't, we're not saying that's open space. So your question was,
Yeah.
were you asking, are you counting that 12-foot area as open
Yeah.
space? I'm saying no, we're not.
So what's the difference in the proposal is what I'm not understanding.
Yeah, what the difference is per our
We
code, you
didn't have it
cannot
before.
build any structures outside the building pad. And so this would give them the ability to build a pergola, for instance, in that 12-foot area.
Okay, so essentially,
like in-
for
I see
calculation
now, okay.
purposes, you're actually adding open space, right? Or adding common area. But in effect, you're not really changing that. You're just allowing them to build in those spots,
What
like
I'm
deck or
saying is
whatever.
in some areas, like on this pad, the open space would have been 12 and a half, or 12 feet this way, right up to the back of the unit. We've now said that's not open space because we're giving them the right to, build a covered deck.
So you've reduced open space, but you're saying you're still meeting your requirements.
Is this the original? This is the new one, I guess.
This is the-
Okay.
this is the-
And this, you're still meeting the
we
requirements
still
then?
need- Because we were over before, so we made into that.
Okay, so before you were counting it, sorry, and on this one you are.
That's what I was trying to explain, thank you.
And Paul, just to clarify again, you explained on that pad 87, was it, or something? Or
Let's go to the
84?
close-up.
Well, it's just a generic question about the entire perimeter.
So let's
Has-
just look really,
My question is the setbacks have been maintained from what was approved?
the only difference would be any place that we've added the 12 and a half, or the 12-foot area, so like if 72 had one, then it would be less, but the building stays in the same spot.
Right, and you're not showing it on 72 or
We actually
180,
submitted an
A
update
revi-
to this.
update?
You're not being shown.
but the building is
The
still,
buildings didn't move,
The only building that moved is 84.
is
Right.
84.
but it still stayed.
Well, 80, yeah.
The drive.
It's-
There was maybe a little.
No, the building
adjustment
moved
to one right next to it, but.
But
If
for-
we go
but-
to the close-up, you can kind of see this little hump in the wetlands.
Yeah,
Little hump in the wetlands, if you draw a line straight up.
Lines
makes
up.
that corner,
yeah,
makes that corner, so
Yeah.
we haven't moved that kind of critical setback.
And that's the only trail that's impacted, is that one behind 84 to 87.
Yeah.
We felt like that maybe with adding the 12 feet, that just got really tight, and that kind of makes a nice little area for those 4-unit owners. We didn't really want trails going through there, especially where there's trails on both sides.
Both sides.
Hey, Michael, go back to your phasing plan. Right there. You've got 4 in this phase, 3 in this phase, and it appears 5 in that. Why just 3? Why doesn't that have 5?
Let's go to this is the open space plan. Let's go to the phasing plan. I think that'll be a little clearer. So remember the original phasing plan, each cul-de-sac was in the 3rd phase.
Right.
We really just want to move this almost like it's in the phase 1. Been enough interest from buyers and kind of feels like it's naturally part of phase 1. So that's why there's only 4 in that. For phase 2, we have to loop this road per your code.
Right.
So once we've looped it, but this is all the units that really want to build in phase 2. But then we end up with these 3 pockets that have units but are divided by the road. I guess we could do all this as phase 3, but it would have this hole in the middle, so we end up doing 3 pods anyway. And I've had some other plats recently with the county recorder. They're like, instead of doing 3 pads that are separated all together in one plat, why don't you just do them as one plat? having to be in a project over in Heber. So that's why we decided to do that 3A, B, and C.
So those will be recorded at the same time?
Maybe not.
So again, why not have 5 and 3C?
I guess if you guys are hung up on that, we can, but for his first phase, Watts wanted to do this many units, and then this is what was left over.
I'm just saying, if we in the future say a minimum unit per phase, 3 seems like a small number per phase.
So one comment I'd have is.
Sorry, we talked about this a lot last month.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you warned us.
Right.
Yeah, the response I got was, we have a process, and so here we are.
That's correct. So as for the phase numbering, we've talked about it, it's a lot easier if we just go 1 through 8 instead of
Yep.
1A,
I'm
2B,
fine.
3C.
This was partly driven by their marketing people, but
It's
we
a
can.
complicated thing on the plats to have that type of a numbering system, so.
All right.
Can we get a motion to move this along?
Do we have any other questions for
No.
Mr. Berg?
You can
So
Okay.
know what you're gonna
Paul, I assume this is being done for the same reasons that you made the request last month. They don't want to be on the hook for the property taxes for the bigger phases and more lots.
That's only part of the issue here, just based on some marketing they've done. There's some real interest to have this now, not wait till phase 3. And then, but this area, they are conscious of, let's just not do too many units at once. I think as people start to worry about the economy, you're gonna see more and more developers do this over the next year to 18 months.
Michael, can you go back to the slide of the proposed amendments, please?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul.
I would like to make a motion, but I admit I'm going to do what Michael talked about, which is I am not going to put all 3 things in my motion. And if everybody is going to jump up and down about that, tell me now. I move that we approve Amendment 1 and 2 to add the limited common areas behind 37 units, and that each limited common area is 12 feet deep. And Amendment 2, adjust the pad dimensions and driveway of Unit 84 to 55 feet by 70 feet, as opposed to the current dimensions of 55 feet by 60 feet. That we accept the findings of staff, and my motion for these 2 amendments does not have any conditions on it.
I'll second that.
Just to clarify what your motion includes, so is your motion that there is no amendment to the phase plan?
She
In
just
this
I-
brought it
motion,
up.
she's breaking
In
it.
this motion, there is
Oh,
only
you're-
the first
in the
2.
first two.
Okay.
So I second that.
Okay, we have a motion before us, been moved and second that we recommend approval of the amendments to the plan to add limited common areas behind the 37 units of 12 foot deep and adjust the pad dimensions driveway of Unit 84. The motion recommended accepting the findings. I'm assuming you'll take the second finding out of that
Oh, yes,
motion.
sorry.
So findings 1 and 3.
Findings 1 and 3, yes.
Okay.
So the
Thank you,
trail,
Chairman.
the trail was a private one, not public
Correct.
anyway, so.
Yeah.
Public ones remain.
Okay.
And now is there any obligation to build those when they're on the plans?
So the private trails that they're on the
Yeah,
plan.
when they're showing them?
That gets into an interesting debate. I mean, they've shown them, the public can't use those, but a lot of times when they're on the plans, they're shown to people who buy units, and if they don't happen, then they come back and ask the city, well, why didn't this trail, why didn't this landscaping happen? And so it puts.
I will amend my motion to remove the trail if that would make your life easier.
That would make it easier.
Okay.
That's the only reason I
That's
was
a
like
good
asking
idea.
that. I'm not
Yeah.
opposed to taking that little section out. It's just, should it be documented kind of thing, so.
And I do amend my motion to approve the removal of the private trail that runs south of lots 84 through 87.
Okay, and I'll second that.
Okay. So, our amendment has, or recommended for approval, the amendment has three parts. That we will add the limited common areas behind 37 units. We're recommending adjusting the pad dimensions of the driveway of unit 84, and we will recommend allowing them to remove the private trail
South
Okay.
of lots 84
So-
through 87.
south of lots 84 through 87. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay. Now we have one item yet that's outstanding. Natalie got her motion out of the way.
I'll make one.
Okay,
I move that we approve the, have the master plan amendment of Redmond Farms as it concerns the phases, and that phases 2 and 3 will be changed into 7 phases. And we incorporate the, what was it, item 2 of the proposed findings, that the number of phases will increase from 3 to 8. And I guess I don't have to do anything else.
do we have a second?
No one wants to.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that
And Bill,
we,
your motion is to approve it.
Yes.
Okay.
that we have a recommendation to approve amending the master plan to increase the number of phases from 3 to 8. We're accepting the findings of the staff report, and there are no conditions.
Sorry.
Did I miss anything?
As far as discussion, especially 3A, B, and C really bother me, that they're just these little teeny sections like that. I would rather see those grouped together. In that the 1A, the only reason I think that one makes sense on its own because it's such a separate piece from everything else. Just development, how it develops, it seems like it makes sense to break that out. But the 3A, B, and C, I think are silly and shouldn't, just kind of creating unnecessary stuff. I think those should be grouped together.
And
Into
Michael
one
also
phase, but-
suggested that the phasing be just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera, not A, B, C.
Yeah.
So what would,
Semantics.
so how many
Yeah.
phases would there be then?
5,
That would make
6,
2,
5.
3,
Five. Up from 3.
6.
be 6.
Six.
There's 6.
Six.
Still.
So you got phase
Including
1's already
one.
Oh,
done.
because I didn't count phase 1.
1A is
yeah.
2.
Yeah.
5, and then these would be
5 to
6.
5
Okay,
So I'd recommend that change to the motion. But
okay, sure.
So you want to restate it?
Yeah, please.
So that we approve changing the phases from 3 to 6.
And the numbering.
by lumping.
And then-
And the numbering should be 1 to 6.
And then by
Okay.
doing that, you're lumping
We
phase.
we did
3A,
accept
B,
it,
and
so the motion is now, we're recommending approval of the phase change to go from 3 to 6 with sequential numbers.
Does the second approve of that as well?
Do we need to clarify that
That
the
Yeah.
3A, B, and
is-
C are all one phase?
3A, B, and C is all one phase.
Okay,
I second that.
okay. Any discussion on the motion?
Just for the sake of precedent and clarity, I think it's a really bad idea to say 1 month we're doing one thing and 1 month we're doing another.
Well, these are different items, though. One was a code text amendment, which would have allowed multiple plats in one phase. This is hitting it from the side of amending the master plan. So,
Right.
the same end of multiple plats, but a different course of action on getting there. One is, again, a code text amendment, where this is a master plan amendment, but I
It's
can see what you're
discretionary.
saying.
And
Yeah,
there's a little,
it's
there's a
just-
little more order here, because the other one, they could have
Got anything?
recorded plats in any order, non-contiguous, it could have been a mess,
Yeah, and
one at a time.
but I'd recommend we do make some change, that your phases have to be certain sizes or certain requirements, because the way I was looking at this is, did the phases make sense as they're developed if this was presented to us the first time, right? And where it gets excessive to me, I think, is in 3A, B, and C, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. I think if we had something in ordinances to limit the phasing, that it has to be a certain size, whether that be area or unit
Percentage.
size, I think it could be either one or both possibly. But anyways, that's something more for a future thing, so
Yeah.
that we
Just,
don't get.
just a
things.
question of a procedural thing. If we can't make another motion for a code text amendment because it wasn't on the agenda as such, but can we make that a finding that we recommend that we consider? One of our findings of considering this item is that we consider a code text amendment to limit, or to specify a minimum number of units in a
phase.
In a
Yeah, I
phase.
can't say there's a formal way of, you have to go through a motion to direct staff to do that.
Uh-huh.
I think that just if the planning commission would like us to take that route, we'll put it on the agenda and you can consider that in the
Okay.
future meeting.
Right,
So-
okay.
So we don't.
So I'll put that on our radar for the next
Okay.
couple months to have us take a look at it.
Okay. Any discussion on the motion? Melanie, you got that all down, I'm sure. Okay.
No? I do need to know who seconded that. Was that you?
That was Kevin. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
Okay. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Stephen Kusenberry, agent for Jeanette S. Higginson Trust and T&M Holdings LLC, is requesting preliminary final approval of Haven Farms, a rural preservation subdivision, for a 13-lot subdivision of 67.43 acres in the RA 143 zone at 1170 South Center Street. Michael?
All right, thank you, Chairman Kohler. We received an application for Haven Farms, which would be a rural preservation subdivision. This is for preliminary and final, so rural preservation subdivisions, one of the incentives to go this route is we have a quicker approval process, so we have less meetings. So this would be the one time that you would take a look at this item. There wouldn't be a final that would come back to the planning commission. I guess the only other way you'd see this, if it's continued, then you'd see it in a future meeting. But once you make a recommendation to city council, then it will go to them for preliminary and final approval also. So land use summary, the property is 67.43 acres. It's entirely in the RA 143 zoning district, which is our acre zoning. The proposal contains 13 lots. There are 2 shared private driveways as part of the proposal. There is a public trail that would be built by the developer along Highway 113 and a dedicated 20-foot public trail easement parallel to the right-of-way on 113. And there is a FEMA floodplain that runs through the property along Snake Creek. So this property is located in the south end of town. You can see Main Street at the top. We have Highway 113 down the center of the map. And then actually the southern and western boundary of this property is the city limits right now. You can see Snake Creek running through. There's an LDS church on the north east corner. There's a closer view of the property. And so currently we have a public road that accesses the 2 access points for the LDS church. There's a temporary turnaround. We have a driveway that accesses the existing home. And I think, talking to the applicant, Steve Wisenberry, that home was built in 1921. So it is historic per our code. It's not a pioneer structure by any means, but it is the one home on site. We have a larger structure that was approved as an agricultural greenhouse. Then we have another outbuilding up at the very north end next to Snake Creek that is on the property. This is a copy of the proposed plan. This shows some of the main features of this. Is we have the two driveways, the one on the south side of the property, and then the driveway coming off of the city street that accesses the 4 lots on the north. We also have a floodplain down the center of the property. So this shows the 100-year floodplain, which is the 1% chance flood for any given year. And then it has the required setback from that floodplain shown. And so, talking to the applicant, the proposal isn't to have building envelopes per lot. These show kind of possible driveway locations and possible location of homes. Those would be removed, and homes and accessory structures would just need to meet the setbacks for the zone. So we're not trying to build building envelopes into this plan. Again, nothing could be built within the setback for the 100-year flood. That's one thing that we're required to meet by code and to meet FEMA's requirements for floodplain management. We do have, well, the basis for this proposal is the rural preservation subdivision, where the density is not any greater than 1 unit for every 5 acres, so they're exceeding that requirement. I think we've got 1 unit for every 5.14 acres on 5.14 acres on 5.1s. All lots will be deed restricted, so they can never be further subdivided. Some of the code requirements are that the homes don't necessarily need to connect to sewer if they're a certain distance from the sewer line, but this proposal is to connect all the homes to the sewer line, which generally is looked at as a good thing for the community. We also have, again, the public trail that will be built along the road. We do have a 100-foot setback along Highway 113, which will need to be noted on the plat. With these size of lots, it doesn't appear to be an issue. And again, the floodplain is quite large down in the southern area, so I guess the only real chance that a home might be up to 100 feet would be up in this area. But again, that would be noted on the plat to make sure that no structures are within 100 feet of our Highway 113, which is our entry corridor for the city. So this is really a nice way of preserving that entry corridor by having low density as you drive in from the south side of the city. There was a planned unit development that had gone through the approval process on this property with many units, well over 100. So this is a vast change from that, using our rural preservation. One of the items that was asked for, and as a variance, which is a rare item in Midway to grant variance, is the number of homes on this one private driveway on the south side. We have 9 on the private driveway, which the limit is actually 5 per code. There are UDOT requirements for spacing of driveways, and so it actually made it so they could have 2 driveways based off of UDOT's requirements, but per our code they could actually have 3, and they would have been able to meet our code for how many homes per driveway if they wouldn't have had to deal with UDOT's requirements. So because of the hardship created from UDOT's requirements, the Board of Adjustment did grant a variance to allow 4 extra units on that southern driveway. So that has been approved, and so 9 units is what will be allowed at this point.
So is the only reason that's an issue is because that's a private road, it's not a city road then?
That's correct. So specifically,
Because you could do a cul-de-sac like that, no problem, right? It's just...
Yeah, and this driveway actually has a different profile that's required. There's not any type of right-of-way that's required, so the lots will actually go to the center of the driveway. It also only needs to be 20 feet wide with 5-foot clear areas per side of the driveway, so that's also an incentive to lower the amount of infrastructure that's required for this type of subdivision. And it actually doesn't even need to be paved. In this case, they are proposing to pave it. Their construction plans show that. But the idea is, again, this isn't a private, it's just a private driveway maintained by the homeowners association. It doesn't require a right-of-way or common area.
What's the width of the pavement?
So discussing this, we had a meeting, Wes and I had a meeting with Steve, and we discussed, originally the plans were showing 24 feet of paved area. And so in our discussion, to my recollection, we've gone down to 20 feet wide, which is what the minimum the code requires. And so we're looking at a 20-foot paved area with 5 feet of clear area on both sides of the driveway.
Which they would have been allowed under the code, correct me if I'm
Yeah,
wrong. They could have done a gravel road
they could
under
have done
their,
a gravel road,
under
that's
the rural
correct.
preservation.
Yeah, that is correct. That is correct. Let's see,
So then
So-
the city doesn't plow this then?
the city would not plow it, that's correct. They're required to have a homeowners association, and in their CCNRs for the homeowners association, they have to have a good maintenance plan for both driveways. And what's been suggested with this is there's actually 2 separate, really associations, one that would handle the southern driveway, and then these 4 lots would handle the northern. So they would each maintain their own driveway, which is allowed by code also.
But the difference I see as far as approving the variance to go to 9, so is that a part
That's
of the
a
thing?
done
That's
deal.
done?
It's a done deal, yeah.
Okay.
Well, and just to clarify, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, the variance that was required is because the rural preservation limits the amount of units per cul-de-sac versus the city ordinance allows for other subdivisions to have.
Yeah, it's a private
11
road versus
11
the
units.
other.
Yeah.
I mean,
There
sounds like it's a
was-
done deal. My only concern is if you're increasing that, then there should be some provisions to provide for the safety, including fire truck access and stuff like that. But given they're paving paving it, that's a good thing
So
at
we
least.
did-
So it's kind of mitigating the risks that I think you're doing
Yeah.
and going above the 5.
So the
That's
rural
where the
preservation
difference is.
subdivision, when we adopted that code, we did meet with the fire marshal, made sure that he was fine with those minimum requirements for a driveway. So they've stated they are fine with that, and they actually allow more units on one access on one driveway, so.
Okay.
I
However,
believe it's actually
on
30
a
units.
cul-de-sac though, it typically is.
Yeah, on one access.
But I've been in some situations where you're looking at gravel, they're usually more picky. At least in my experience on projects like that they're more picky in what you're doing in hard surface, but it's a done deal anyways. But I'm glad they're paving it at least, because
Yeah,
that helps
yeah,
mitigate
I
some
think
of that
that'll create
concern.
a really nice atmosphere.
And they're paving it.
Wish it was
to the
24.
Standard of 20 feet.
Yeah.
So the trail that's along the road, does that connect to anything beyond the church and south of this property?
So this trail will connect all the way up to Main Street.
Yeah.
But is there any trail, in other words, is this an island?
No, it
That-
actually
and the
connects.
Or is there more
No.
trail north of the church and south
all
of this
the way.
property?
End of the year, you'll have everything
So
all the way
right
set
now,
free.
there's a trail existing to 970 South, so in front of Eldon's Landing and the LDS
Right.
Church. And then the trail ends on from Main Street coming down at 350 South. So this year, we're building this section of trail. So that,
That will connect.
we
Oh,
should
that
have that
you are
by
gonna
the end
build it.
of,
Oh, excellent.
End of the building season.
In my lifetime, excellent.
We're city limits on the south, right?
Yeah, so we'll be all the way down to the city limits on the south, but we really do want to connect farther south. And if the county builds the rail trail, which would really connect all the way up to Heber and all the way to the trail around Deer Creek,
Mhm.
we would really want to connect this section, because that would give
That'd be
more
nice.
residents
That
That would
would
be
be
very
so
nice.
those
nice.
trails.
Would they do it when they're doing the widening of the road down there?
They would.
They know?
That's a separate
Okay.
item. So really, next year, they're planning on adding shoulders to the sides of Highway
That's it.
113 and the turn lane at Tate Lane. But the rail trail is something that's been in the plans for a while.
Years.
I don't know if you want to get into this discussion, but
No.
No,
I
no.
can give you.
It's
No,
almost
no,
No.
no, no.
Mr. Queensbury deserves an award for going through everything.
We just want to connect those trails together eventually. This will be our south boundary for our trail system until we connect them into the county.
A quick question, this is probably directed also to the applicant, is the existing trail that kind of wraps around,
That was the leftover from an old plan, there'll be nothing there.
Well-
This is not gonna be there.
that's not going to be there.
No,
Mm-mm.
So-
It was just a holdover.
So is that going to be removed? Because there's
Yeah.
that in existing vegetation. Will that all be taken out,
No,
or
they'll leave the trees, but they're just people's individual.
But the tra-
lots.
okay.
There's no easement for it.
trail's taken out?
We just want to have less hassle
Okay.
between people.
Yeah.
Is that
So-
is that a trail up in the
That was
northern?
an accident, it shouldn't have been on there, it was
Okay.
earlier.
It's a private.
Yes,
We
sir.
had some plans.
Yeah.
Right.
So one question is, while we're speaking of trails, our master plan called for a trail along Snake Creek, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And
Didn't happen.
Corbin and I can talk about this, but basically, when we've looked at developments on this property, that's been an issue that we've taken a look at closely. We pushed that as a city. We actually went to arbitration on this item on requiring the trail along Snake Creek, and what that came
In
down
this
to
property or
was-
different area?
This one.
This
one.
property
Okay.
specifically. So what it came down to is we can require trails as a city, but we also have to look at what's called rough proportionality, which is the impact of the density of this development on the trail as compared to the community as a whole. So we almost have to look at trips per day on the trail. And if the trips per day out of the people living in the development is so low, then we actually don't have the ability to require all the trails in the project, or we end up paying for those trails as a city. The arbitrator that we talked to basically said we could require the trail along the road, but as for requiring a trail up the Snake Creek, he didn't. His opinion was that was probably too far based off the density of the subdivision. So that's where we ended up in arbitration.
And was that based on a higher density at that time?
Yeah, because we've looked at several different
Right.
plans. We looked at a 3-lot plan at one point. We looked at a 20-lot plan. This is kind of in the middle of that.
It's nice.
Yeah, so I mean, we would like the trail, but just based off of the
Compared to
professional
100.
opinions we've had, it doesn't look like it's something we can require at this
Yeah.
point in time.
We had approved that building for a hydroponic operation.
Yeah.
Does that still apply, or because that wasn't done, that goes away, or is that still approved?
Well, that's an interesting question. And so that was approved as a conditional use.
Mm-hmm.
There's not an expiration on a conditional use. There could be on a building permit if that's not acted on within 180 days. As for the conditional use, it's still there.
Okay.
As long as they met the conditions of that approval, they could still move forward. But talking to the applicant, it sounds like that's not the case at all at this point.
The house is gonna be sold, and we just don't wanna deal with a freaking barn from hell anymore.
Hey, we had to deal with it for
What do you
several
really think?
sessions, right?
So many, like,
And so this building, there can only be one dwelling unit per lot. And so most likely there'll be a new home built on this, on lot number 5, and so this could not have any living space in it.
right,
So that's the one thing we know for sure.
yeah.
Okay.
Corbin,
I guess one other thing I'd want to
So-
put in the, just on the record, is we do have an existing home. If there's a new home built on 6, there can't be any living space in that home. If it remains, if they decide to tear it down, then that would be an option, but if it stays, it would have to turn into something other than living space.
now can I
Yes.
torture Corbin? This is one of those really fun little things. That southern portion of the FEMA floodplain is a man-made floodplain. If UDOT ever built a bigger culvert,
It wouldn't flood,
it wouldn't flood. The floodplain goes away.
yes.
That then rather dramatically changes the plat. How do we deal with that?
So I think I can address that, because when we got the new FEMA flood maps, we had the 1983 maps, and then we got the 2011 maps, is what we're working off of now. That is correct. This area used to not be floodplain, but when they went through and did their detailed analysis, they found that this culvert was substandard.
Yeah.
So if there's a flood, the water can't get across the road, so it ends up going directly to the south, and it heads down to Deer Creek. So this whole area is a big floodplain, but if that culvert's fixed, then this floodplain goes away. This floodplain on site right here reduces in size,
Yeah,
and the floodplain actually on this side of the road increases.
yeah,
We have more water on this side. So as a city, what we did was we actually adopted a tentative floodplain map back in, I think, 2010 to address that issue. We put everybody on notice that, hey, your floodplain could increase on this side of the road if that culvert ever increases. And so if the culvert does increase in size, we'll actually go through a letter of map revision with FEMA to adjust the floodplain map officially. But what it leaves on this plat is a floodplain that doesn't match And really, it could always stay that way. I mean, what's shown here is gonna be contained completely within the future floodplain. But if, let's say, property owner number one wanted to remove this floodplain off of the plat map, he'd have to go through a plat amendment process for that to happen.
But,
Yeah, and he'd still have the 100-foot setback.
Right, anyway.
yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I'm trying to hash out here is, does it affect this in any way if the culvert is made bigger because it's a man-made floodplain?
Yeah, I don't think it does, because the floodplain, the future floodplain would be entirely contained within this floodplain on the plat.
Yeah.
So,
And so the 5.73 acres of lot 1, I'm assuming goes to the road?
yeah, it actually encompasses the public trail easement, and so it would go all the way to the right of way.
And then the same thing of I can't even
Nine.
guess what 9 was. But the same thing with 9, it goes all the way.
And 10.
Yeah, it comes all the way down along, Snake Creek's really the dividing line.
Okay,
So it has some, and then also 10 would have some of that.
And 11.
okay. I just wanted to see if there were any future issues created by if UDOT ever got their act together and built a bigger culvert.
Yeah,
Not-
I
not on
can't
this
identify
side.
any negative
On the
impacts.
other.
Big negative
On the
impacts.
other.
Big negative impacts.
This
It'd be
side.
positive in the fact that they could go through a plat amendment to reduce that floodplain.
But they could not increase the number of units.
No.
That was the point I wanted to double check.
Okay. Any more questions for staff on the proposal?
Okay, you want me to
Do we
start
have,
quest?
not yet, not yet. I got one more thing to do here. Does the proponent have anything he'd like to add, or do we have any questions for the proponent?
You know, one thing I should mention, sorry to interrupt, sorry, Steve. So we did go to the water board, and we did get a recommendation for approval. And we did make an adjustment since your staff report was written. And that adjustment was based off of the width of the road. The water board did give us that ability to go in and adjust it based off of the width of that road. And so this number has actually been reduced from what's in your staff report down to 199.85. The one thing that's not included in here is there is a well on site. They would like to go through a change application to move those water rights into the city system. And whatever that number ends up being through the state engineer's office, that would reduce this overall number once that change application is approved. Yeah, it may be an acre foot. It's not gonna be it's not gonna be a large.
So
water.
the proposal is for culinary water to be tied to
Yeah, to our city system.
our city system?
Mhm.
Okay. And same thing with sewer?
Correct.
Which is good.
Yep. I do have some findings listed in your staff report. So the proposal does meet the minimum requirements of the RA-143 zoning district, does meet the intent of the general plan for that zoning district. Proposal does comply with the requirements of the Rural Preservation Subdivision Code. Subdivision helps comply with the vision as stated in the general plan to preserve open space and rural atmosphere. And all 13 lots will be deed restricted, so they can never be further subdivided. And the subdivision will build a public trail that will help complete the master trail plan, which make pedestrians safer by allowing them a place to recreate off of Highway 113. And then, sorry, Steve, if you had any comments to make.
There were just some other things like with the water, we gotta take that bridge out, I mean, that'll all just come out in other.
Yeah, the water board suggested that the bridge for the existing driveway be taken out so it doesn't affect flooding or anything along those lines.
Once the road's in.
And that's gonna be between two separate lots, now,
Right.
so it makes sense that be removed.
They're really fun to do.
Proposed conditions, CCNRs must be submitted to the city for review. We wanna make sure that the private driveway is maintained properly, so, those are gonna be provided to the city. And then deed restrictions will be recorded towards each of the 13 lots and must be submitted to the city for review. So when the plat's recorded, those need to be ready. So as soon as the plat's created, those 13 deed restrictions are recorded immediately after those lots are created.
Ready?
Okay,
I have a
I
comment
apologize,
for the-
Michael, for jumping the gun on your presentation.
I have a comment for the applicant, and just to state publicly, I mean, it sounds like a lot of this is already kind of done with the trails. I think it's a little short-sighted to not do that, because that potentially could have been one of the best corridors of a trail, you know, in Midway, and I think it would be a benefit to the residents in that area. I understand stuff that's gone on, stuff like that, but I'd just like to state publicly that I think having allowing a trail along that thing, I think would benefit both the community and, you know, your development, I think, as a whole.
Do you, members of the commission, have any questions for the proponent? Do you have anything you'd like us to know, or we're good? Okay. Then I will look for a motion.
I move that we approve the preliminary and final approval for Haven Farms, which is a rural preservation subdivision, the 13-lot subdivision on 67.43 acres, in the RA 143 zone. Property is located at 1170 South Center Street. We accept the findings of staff, and we accept the conditions of staff, and we acknowledge that the water board recommendation has been altered since the application was submitted. And we accept the altered recommendation.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion that has been moved and seconded that we recommend preliminary approval for the
And final.
Preliminary and final approval for the Haven Farms Rural Preservation Subdivision, which is a 13-lot subdivision, 6.43 acres in the RA 143 zone. Property is located 1170 South Center Street. We accept the motion would accept the findings of the staff report with the proposed conditions that the CC&Rs must be submitted to the city for review, and the deed restrictions will be recorded towards all 13 lots. Those must be also submitted to the city for review. And finally, the motion recommend that we acknowledge the water board changes and accept the changes. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, I would look for a motion to adjourn.
Oh. Okay, well, I move that we adjourn.
Second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bob, don't go anywhere for a second. I need to talk to you.
Wake up, Bob.
It's a tile issue.
Husband's still gonna be on the snow this winter?
I got chastised by your friends.
Best.
I better go take
First time they do
Good work, guys, tonight. That was a hard, long meeting. Well done.
Gives him.
And we got done by 10. We got done by